So settle in, get comfortable, and let's talk about a show that spent over 2 decades doing things no other cartoon on television ever attempted and hiding secrets inside nearly every single frame it ever produced. Family Guy is one of those rare programs that managed to become genuinely embedded in the culture. Not just popular, not just frequently watched, actually woven into the way people talk, joke, and reference the world around them. Somewhere between 1999 and right now, this animated series about a loudmouth Rhode Island family slipped past your defenses and lodged itself somewhere deep in your memory. And there it has stayed, comfortable and permanent, a landmark of a certain kind of American absurdity that nobody else was making quite like this. But most people who grew up watching Family Guy, who knew every cutaway, could quote every scene, laughed at every chicken fight, never really knew how deep the rabbit hole went. They saw the surface, they got the jokes. What they missed were the layers underneath, the hidden references that required decades of film knowledge to catch, the background details that only revealed themselves on repeat viewings, the threads of actual lore connecting episodes years apart, the callbacks so obscure they felt like secrets the writers planted, just to see if anyone was paying attention. This is a long journey through all of it. Every wild story, every hidden Easter egg, every production secret, every piece of buried lore that the show hid inside itself across more than 25 years of storytelling. We are going to go slow. We are going to be thorough. And by the time we reach the end, you will know this show in a way that most people who watched every single episode never did. Let's go all the way back to the beginning. Part 1. How Family Guy was born. The origin story most people don't know. There is a version of this story that most people know. Seth MacFarlane made a cartoon. It aired after the Super Bowl. Millions of people watched it. It got canceled. It came back from the dead. And then it ran for so long that it outlasted almost everything else in its genre. That is the short version. The actual story is considerably more interesting, and it begins not in a television network boardroom, but in a tiny animation studio at Hanna-Barbera in Burbank, California, where a 23-year-old kid from Connecticut was sitting at a desk drawing cartoons for other people's shows while quietly incubating something else entirely. Seth Woodbury MacFarlane was born on the 26th of October, 1973, in Kent, Connecticut, a small New England town of the kind that becomes a specific kind of personality when you grow up there. He knew from an early age that he wanted to make cartoons. He has talked about how, as a child, he would watch Looney Tunes and the Flintstones the way other kids watch sports, studying them, taking them apart, understanding intuitively that the thing he was watching was made by people and that he could one day be one of those people. He enrolled at the Rhode Island School of Design, an elite art and design school in Providence, where he studied animation and graduated in 1995. During his time there and in the period immediately following, he produced 2 short animated films that would, with hindsight, feel almost embarrassingly prescient about what was coming. The first was called The Life of Larry, and the second was a follow-up called Larry and Steve. Both featured a heavyset, not especially bright middle-aged man named Larry and his talking dog Steve. If you watch those shorts today, the resemblance is immediate and undeniable. Larry moves like Peter. Steve talks like Brian. The rhythm of their relationship, the patient, sardonic dog, and the chaotic, impulsive man, is the exact dynamic that would become the beating heart of Family Guy. MacFarlane brought those shorts to Hanna-Barbera, where he got a job working on shows like Johnny Bravo, Cow and Chicken, and Dexter's Laboratory. He was doing good work, learning the industry, but those Larry shorts were sitting there in the background of his mind, and he knew they were the foundation of something bigger. The path to Fox is slightly indirect. According to the story MacFarlane has told in various interviews over the years, executives at what was then Hanna-Barbera connected him with Fox through a circuitous route involving Mad TV, the sketch comedy series. Fox development executives saw MacFarlane's short films and asked him to come in. He assumed the meeting was about producing animated inserts for Mad TV. Instead, Fox looked at what he had brought Larry, Steve, these 2 characters and this specific comic sensibility, and asked him to develop it into a full series. He was 24 years old. MacFarlane spent the next stretch of time transforming the 2 characters from those short films into the Griffin family. Larry became Peter Griffin. Same body type, same fundamental comedic premise, but now given a family, a history, a hometown, and a more fully realized personality. Steve the dog became Brian Griffin, still the voice of reason, still the sarcastic intellectual, still the one character who could cut through the chaos with a dry observation and a martini. MacFarlane built a wife named Lois around Peter, gave them 3 children including a baby with a secret genius intellect, and placed the whole household in a fictional Rhode Island town he initially called Stoolbend before settling on a different name. He pitched Fox a 15-minute pilot in May of 1998. Fox liked what they saw well enough to greenlight a full series order, and the show was scheduled to premiere in a time slot that any television producer would sacrifice almost anything to obtain. The 31st of January 1999, right after Super Bowl 33. That single fact that Family Guy's very first episode aired in the most watched television slot in American broadcasting, immediately following one of the most watched sporting events in American culture, shaped everything that came after. It meant the show's first numbers were almost artificially high. Around 22 million people watched Death Has a Shadow, the premiere episode, and most of them were there because they had already been sitting on their couch watching the game. But those people, those tens of millions of warm, somewhat snack-addled viewers who had not necessarily been waiting for a new animated comedy, encountered something they did not expect, and a meaningful portion of them came back. The first season averaged approximately 12.8 million households. Those are legitimate, hard-won numbers. Not just Super Bowl overflow. People were finding the show, telling other people about it, and returning to it week after week. The show that premiered that January evening was set in a fictional version of Rhode Island, a made-up town where a working-class family lived in a suburb and went about their chaotic daily lives. Peter Griffin, the patriarch, worked at the happy-go-lucky toy factory in the early episodes, a job that suited his character beautifully. Assembly line work at a place with an earnestly cheerful name, occupied by a man whose internal life ran at about that same frequency of innocent stupidity. He would later get a job at the Pawtucket Patriot Brewery, which served the show's purposes even better given his close and abiding relationship with beer. Lois Griffin, his wife, was an educated woman from a wealthy family, the Pewterschmidts, who had married down in the eyes of her father Carter, a recurring character whose contempt for Peter and his working-class roots provided a slow-burning background tension across countless episodes. Lois played piano, genuinely loved her chaotic husband despite everything, and served as the closest thing the family had to functional adult supervision. She was sharp, occasionally ruthless, and deeply aware of the absurdity of her life in a way that made her a more complex character than the patient wife archetype she might have been reduced to in less careful hands. Their children were Meg, Chris, and Stewie. Meg was 15, attending high school, struggling with popularity and identity in ways that felt grounded and relatable in those early seasons. Chris was 13, awkward and sweet and not very academically inclined, but genuinely warm. Stewie was 1 year old, able to walk and speak with an elaborate British accent, and quietly building weapons of mass destruction in his bedroom while planning to murder his mother and conquer the known world. And then there was Brian, the family dog, who walked upright, drank dry martinis, drove a car, and was in almost every measurable way the most intellectually sophisticated member of the household. The voice cast that MacFarlane assembled to bring these characters to life was a choice that would define the show's identity for the next 2.5 decades. MacFarlane himself voiced Peter, Brian, Stewie, and Quagmire, 4 distinct, fully realized voices from a single throat. The feat he performed in that recording booth, maintaining those 4 separate characters across hundreds of episodes, represents one of the most sustained vocal acting performances in animation history. Alex Borstein voiced Lois, bringing a particular warmth and a slightly wry edge to the character that kept her grounded even as the show around her grew more outlandish. Seth Green, who had been a young actor in films like Can't Hardly Wait, voiced Chris. His audition story has become something of a production legend. MacFarlane and the team were seeing actor after actor come in doing their best interpretation of an aimless, surfer-adjacent teenage boy. Then Seth Green walked in and did something no one had expected. He based the voice on an impression of Buffalo Bill, the serial killer played by Ted Levine in Silence of the Lambs, reimagined as an 11-year-old. MacFarlane was reportedly thrown by this choice in the moment, but it worked. Whatever inexplicable alchemy that particular creative decision produced, It gave Chris an immediately identifiable vocal quality that has never quite fit into any obvious category, which is exactly why it suited the character. Meg was originally voiced by Lacey Chabert, who, at the time, was also playing Gretchen in Mean Girls and had voice acting experience from The Wild Thornberrys. Chabert voiced Meg through the first season, and the technical credits acknowledge her contribution, but she left after season 1 and the role was taken over by Mila Kunis beginning in season 2, where it has remained ever since. Kunis was barely 17 when she began voicing Meg, and she has kept the role for her entire professional life. There is an Easter egg that almost no one thinks about sitting right there in that transition. If you go back and watch season 1 very carefully, particularly the very early episodes, Meg's voice has a slightly different quality to it, a different timbre, a slightly different emotional register. The character is the same, the writing is the same. But the voice is different, and once you hear it, you cannot unhear it. Meg from Death Has a Shadow is not quite the same Meg from Brian in Love. Both are fully legitimate versions of the character, but they are Meg through slightly different prisms. The show's first full season aired through the spring of 1999, and while the numbers were solid, Fox began making the scheduling decisions that would nearly kill the show entirely. During its second season, Family Guy was moved to Thursday nights at 9 in the evening, placing it in direct competition with Frasier on NBC, one of the most successful comedies on television at the time. This was not a fair fight. The ratings dropped substantially. Fox then moved the show to Tuesday nights, where it competed with Who Wants to Be a Millionaire on ABC, which in 1999 and 2000 was a genuine cultural phenomenon, pulling in audiences that had not been seen for that kind of program in years. Again, not a fair fight. Again, the ratings suffered. The constant rescheduling, the inability of Fox to give the show a stable home and let the audience find it, had a cascading effect that went beyond just the ratings. It disrupted the writing room. It created uncertainty about whether the show would even have a future. It made it difficult to plan long-term story arcs or character development because nobody knew from one season to the next whether there would be another season. By the end of the third season in 2002, Fox made the decision to cancel Family Guy. Given what the network had done to the show's scheduling across 3 seasons, this felt less like a verdict on quality and more like the inevitable conclusion of 3 years of institutional neglect. The show that had launched to 22 million viewers after the Super Bowl was gone, apparently for good, but something was already happening that nobody at Fox had quite processed yet. Cartoon Network had acquired the rights to air reruns of Family Guy on their Adult Swim late-night programming block. They had gotten those rights for almost nothing. The show was canceled. The DVD market for animated series was considered a niche concern, and nobody at the network level truly believed that a canceled Fox cartoon about a dysfunctional Rhode Island family was going to become the cornerstone of their late-night strategy. The Adult Swim reruns premiered on the 20th of April 2003, and what happened next was one of the more remarkable turnaround stories in American television history. Almost immediately, Family Guy became the highest-rated program on the entire Adult Swim block. The show was not just holding its own, it was dominating late-night cable viewing against both other cable programs and broadcast competition. Viewership on the Adult Swim block increased by 239% in the wake of Family Guy's arrival. Those are numbers that do not happen by accident. A genuine, passionate, dedicated audience had been there all along, waiting for a place to gather. Simultaneously, the DVD releases of the first and second season's products that Fox had released with modest commercial expectations sold over 400,000 copies. Those sales figures caught everyone's attention, including Fox's. 400,000 DVD copies sold for a show that was supposed to be dead represented a commercial reality that could not be argued with. People were not just watching the reruns. They were buying the show, owning it, sharing it, building physical libraries of it in their homes. By 2004, Fox had reversed course completely. New episodes were ordered. A 4th season was commissioned. The show that had been canceled twice was coming back, and the audience that had kept it alive through reruns and DVD purchases was going to be there when it returned. The 4th season premiered on the 1st of May 2005, placed by Fox in the center of their new Sunday night animation domination lineup, alongside The Simpsons, King of the Hill, and a brand new McFarlane creation called American Dad. The return drew strong numbers. The fan base that had been built in the dark during the years of cancellation was absolutely real, and they showed up in the manner of people who had been waiting. What most viewers watching that season 4 premiere did not fully register was that the show they were watching had changed in subtle but consequential ways during the 3 years away. The writing staff had been scattered by the cancellation and had found other work. New writers had been brought in when the show was revived. MacFarlane himself acknowledged directly that one of the lasting effects of the show's rocky early history was that they were perpetually restaffing the writing room, never quite getting back to the same configuration that had produced those first 3 seasons. The animation had also changed. The early seasons, particularly seasons 2 and 3, had been handled primarily by Rough Draft Studios, and their work had a looser, more expressive quality, a slightly hand-drawn feel that matched the roughness and energy of the comedy. Season 4 came back with a cleaner, smoother animation style that was technically more polished but somehow less alive. The outlines were thicker. The movements were more constrained. Something indefinable but real had been traded away in the transition. Those changes would become more pronounced as the seasons continued. But in 2005, sitting in front of their televisions on that Sunday night in May, most viewers were simply happy the show was back. They were not yet counting what had been lost. What they were about to get was 20 more years of stories. Some of the wildest, strangest, most ambitious, and most hidden detail-rich episodes in the history of American animation. And we are going to go through all of it. Drop a comment right now, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is. I want to know if someone in Tokyo is drifting off to this, or if someone in Toronto is still wide awake. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is a good time. Part 2, The Griffin Family Hidden Depths and Buried Lore. Every character in the Griffin family carries more lore than the show typically surfaces in any given episode, and the secrets hidden in their individual backstories are some of the more rewarding things to unpack when you go looking. Peter Griffin's full name is Peter Löwenbräu Griffin I. The middle name is not a joke, or rather, it is a joke, but it is a specific and intentional one. Löwenbräu is a German beer brand, and its inclusion in Peter's legal name is the show quietly encoding his relationship with alcohol directly into his identity at the document level. He is, in a very literal sense, named after beer. His voice, according to Seth MacFarlane, was directly inspired by a security guard MacFarlane knew during his time in Providence. The specific pattern of speech, the cadence, the slight breathiness, the way certain syllables get slightly elongated came from observing this particular person and internalizing what was funny and specific about how he communicated. MacFarlane has described his influences for the show in general as the loud, opinionated, larger-than-life Irish Catholic men he grew up around in Connecticut. Big personalities, strong opinions, absolutely no filter. Peter Griffin is not a composite of those men so much as a distillation of a certain type that MacFarlane found genuinely compelling to observe. What the show establishes across its early seasons about Peter's family of origin is rich and specific. His father, Francis Griffin, is a strict, deeply Catholic Irish immigrant who views Peter's behavior with a mixture of shame and resignation. His mother, Thelma, is warmer but still fundamentally shaped by Francis's rigidity. The revelation that comes later that Francis is not actually Peter's biological father recontextualizes their entire difficult relationship while also raising questions that the show never quite answers about who the real father is. There is also the recurring presence of Peter's Irish half-brother, and we use that term loosely given how Family Guy handles continuity. Mickey McFinnigan, played in his one substantial appearance by a guest voice. The episode Peter's Two Dads from Season 5, which deals directly with this paternity question, is one of the show's more emotionally earnest efforts, and it does something interesting by giving Peter's grief over Francis a real weight while simultaneously maintaining the show's commitment to absurdist comedy. The two things coexist in that episode in a way that reflects what the early and middle seasons were capable of when they were working well. Lois's family background is arguably more consistently dark than Peter's. Her maiden name is Pewterschmidt, and her father, Carter Pewterschmidt, is established as one of the wealthiest men in New England, a status he achieved through methods that the show only obliquely references, but which clearly involved a certain ruthlessness that Lois, herself, occasionally manifests. The episode Peter's Got Woods touches on Carter's history with race in a way that is pointed but embedded in comedy. The episode Peter's Def Jam deals more directly with what the Pewter-Schmidt fortune actually represents. But the most interesting piece of Lois's hidden backstory is one that the show introduces and then largely abandons. She was once a wild, reckless young woman who did things that bear no resemblance to the composed, functional mother she presents in the show's regular timeline. The episode Let's Go to the Hop from Season 2, where Lois flashes back to a period of her past that involves considerably more chaos than her current persona, plants a seed that the show occasionally returns to. The episode No Meals on Wheels touches on it. Various jokes throughout the series imply that the person Peter married was not always the Lois who exists now, and that transformation is left entirely unexplained. A mystery the show is not interested in solving, but is very interested in occasionally gesturing toward. Then there is Meg. Meg Griffin's full name is Megan Griffin, and she is canonically the oldest of the 3 children, born roughly 15 years before the show begins. Her birth year, or rather, the year she should have been born based on the show's timeline, creates one of the show's most persistent continuity paradoxes because the show ages Meg on screen but then resets her age to match the needs of any given episode. She is sometimes 15, she is sometimes 17, she occasionally appears to be in her mid-20s. This is not unique to Meg. Family Guy does not operate on a realistic or consistent timeline for any of its characters, but it is most noticeable with her because her age matters more to her storylines than it does for Chris or Stewie. One piece of Meg lore that the show deploys in Season 14 is genuinely affecting when you sit with it. The revelation in Peter's sister that Peter's abusive behavior toward Meg is not random cruelty, but an unconscious transmission of a cycle that was done to him. His sister Kara beat him emotionally and physically throughout their shared childhood, and that pattern of finding someone smaller and more vulnerable to redirect aggression toward shaped him in ways he never examined and never understood. Meg learns this. She forgives Peter. They reconcile, and then the show resets, and everything goes back to where it was, because Family Guy in its later seasons could not hold on to a meaningful moment long enough for it to change anything. But for one episode, the lore was there. And the lore explains something real. Chris Griffin carries the least developed backstory of the main children, but there are recurring details about him that reward attention. His friendship with Herbert, the elderly neighbor, a relationship that the show uses as a source of deeply uncomfortable comedy, is given a slightly different reading if you consider that Herbert is one of the few characters in the show who consistently sees Chris as a person worth paying attention to. That this attention comes from a predatory figure does not make the emotional dynamic less complicated, and the show in its better moments is aware of that complication even when it is exploiting it for humor. The character of Chris's invisible imaginary enemy who lives in his closet, described in the pilot episode as the evil monkey, is one of the show's most patient long-term reveals. From the very first season, there is a monkey who lives in Chris's closet and points at him in an unsettling way. And this monkey appears repeatedly over many seasons as a background joke. Then, in the Season 7 episode Hannah Banana, the show finally explains the monkey's backstory in a way that gives him a complete character arc. The monkey's name is never officially given, but he is revealed to have had a normal life, a wife, a career, a whole existence that fell apart when he was betrayed by his wife having an affair with a dog. He retreated to Chris's closet not out of malevolence, but out of heartbreak and social withdrawal. His threatening finger-pointing at Chris all those years was not menace, it was the grief of a broken creature who had nowhere else to go. The story arc concludes with Chris helping the monkey find closure, and the monkey leaves the closet for good. That is 11 seasons of a background gag paid off with a complete emotional resolution. The show hid that storyline in plain sight from Season 1, and only revealed it when enough time had passed that the punchline could land as both funny and genuinely touching. Quagmire, Glenn Quagmire, is not a Griffin family member, but is embedded in the show's lore deeply enough that he belongs here. His background is revealed across multiple episodes to be considerably more tragic and complicated than his surface-level characterization as a serial womanizer suggests. His given name is Glenn Quagmire, but his birth name, as revealed in the episode Quagmire's Dad, was Glenn Quagmire even before his father's gender transition, which means the name was not changed by the transition, but the family context around it was entirely transformed. His father, Ida, formerly Dan Quagmire, a decorated military officer, is played with unexpected sensitivity, and the episode's emotional through line is one of the show's genuine achievements in handling a topic that could easily have been reduced to mere exploitation. Quagmire's age is also a piece of buried lore. In the Season 4 episode Fast Times at Buddy Cianci Jr. High, it is mentioned that Quagmire is 61 years old, which creates a strange temporal reality given how he looks and behaves. The show acknowledges this explicitly. There is a throwaway joke about how he looks much younger, but it raises questions about what kind of existence produces a 61-year-old man who appears to be in his late 30s, and those questions remain permanently unanswered, which is exactly right for this show. Joe Swanson's evolution across the series is its own kind of buried lore. He was introduced in the Season 1 episode, A Hero Sits Next Door, as the new neighbor, a wheelchair-using police officer who had been injured apprehending a criminal during a Christmas miracle confrontation, an origin story that the show later contradicted. The retcon, introduced in the Season 2 episode, He's Too Sexy for His Fat, gives Joe a different injury story involving the Easter Bunny that plays as pure comedy. The original story was played as sincere. The retcon was played as a joke. The tension between those two versions of the same character exists permanently in the show's continuity as a kind of gentle self-mockery about how much it respects its own established facts. Joe's marriage to Bonnie has enough hidden lore to sustain its own episode analysis. Bonnie is pregnant for the first several seasons, a pregnancy that lasts far longer than any biological reality would accommodate, making it one of the show's most sustained jokes about its own internal timeline, and the son she eventually delivers, Susie, is born in later seasons as a daughter, further shuffling the temporal math. But the real buried lore in the Joe and Bonnie relationship is what gets revealed when the show finally examines it honestly in the Season 8 episode Peter Asment and Beyond. Bonnie fell out of love with Joe, sees him as someone to feel sorry for rather than be with, and stays in the marriage out of obligation and inertia. Joe knows this on some level, and has chosen not to confront it because confronting it would mean acknowledging a grief that his personality does not allow him to fully process. That is not a comedic premise. That is a specific kind of quiet devastation that the show introduced, and then stepped around for years, occasionally returning to it in ways that made it impossible to completely forget. Part 3. Ernie the Giant Chicken. A complete history of the greatest absurd feud in animation. If you asked most Family Guy fans to identify the single most iconic running gag in the show's history, many would not say the cutaway format. Many would not say Stewie's British accent, or the Conway Twitty musical interludes, or Peter's extended injury sound effects. Many would say the chicken fights. The feud between Peter Griffin and Ernie the Giant Chicken is, on its face, the simplest possible premise for a recurring bit. A giant chicken gives Peter an expired coupon. Peter gets angry about the expired coupon. They fight. This fight escalates across an entire neighborhood, then across a downtown area, then across multiple vehicles, often concluding with the apparent death of the chicken, after which Peter returns to whatever scene the episode was in the middle of, and picks up exactly where he left off, as though nothing has happened. Ernie invariably survives. The first chicken fight appears in the Season 2 episode Da Boom, the Y2K episode where Peter's fears about the Millennium Bug come spectacularly true and the world ends, requiring the Griffins to set out on a quest to find a Twinkie factory. In the midst of all this apocalyptic chaos, Peter is at a convenience store when a giant chicken offers him a coupon. The coupon is expired. Peter and the chicken fight. The fight goes for an extended sequence, leveling property and causing significant collateral damage, before ending with Peter's apparent victory and his return to the main story. This is presented with perfect deadpan confidence, as though the show expects the audience to simply accept the reality that Peter periodically fights giant chickens over expired coupons as a normal feature of his existence. And the audience accepted it. Not just accepted, embraced. What the show established immediately with that first fight, and what each subsequent fight has built on, is a specific comedy grammar that operates entirely independently of whatever episode it interrupts. The chicken fight is not a cutaway gag in the traditional sense. It does not begin with a setup line and end with a punchline. It is more like a genre intrusion, An action film erupts inside a sitcom for 3 to 5 minutes, complete with the physical choreography, the escalating environment, the music stings, the moments of apparent mortal danger, and then it ends and the sitcom resumes. The second fight, in Blind Ambition from Season 4, is where the show reveals that the first fight was not a one-time thing but the establishment of a pattern. Peter and Ernie encounter each other, recognition passes between them, the look of two men who have fought each other before and know they will fight again, and the second battle begins. This time, the combat takes them through multiple environments in a single, sustained sequence that includes more elaborate stunts, more property destruction, and a more cinematically ambitious layout. The show is declaring that this is now a tradition, that it will be taken seriously on its own terms, and that it will get bigger with each iteration. The continuity of the chicken fights contains some of the show's most carefully constructed hidden lore. The origin of the feud itself carries an interesting temporal wrinkle. In Da Boom, the expired coupon is presented as the starting point. Peter gets angry at Ernie's bad coupon, and the feud begins. But in the Season 6 episode, Meet the Quagmires, where Brian and Stewie travel back to 1984 using Stewie's time machine to undo a change Peter accidentally made to his own past Peter. During the Enchantment Under the Sea dance sequence, accidentally punches Ernie in the jaw while dancing enthusiastically. This is presented as happening in 1984, which would mean Peter and Ernie have a prior encounter that predates the coupon incident by decades. Whether this creates a true continuity paradox or simply adds another layer to a feud whose origins are murkier than the show originally implied depends on how seriously you take the timeline mechanics in a show that treats those mechanics as optional. What the show reveals about Ernie outside of the fights is equally interesting. The third chicken fight, in Brian the Bachelor from Season 4, only a few episodes after the second fight, includes a remarkable interlude. In the middle of the combat, Ernie and his wife Nicole take Peter to dinner, not as part of a scheme, not as a trap, just as an actual social outing, 3 people at a restaurant having a meal together. The joke is that the violence is not personal enough to prevent this kind of normalcy, but it is also doing something stranger than a simple joke. It is humanizing Ernie, giving him a domestic life, making him a person with relationships, and a wife who presumably has to deal with the fact that her husband periodically engages in city-destroying combat with a neighbor. The dinner ends when Peter and Ernie argue about who should pay the check. The fighting resumes immediately. A much later episode reveals that Ernie is not just a random giant chicken, but a genuine citizen of the fictional Rhode Island town where the show is set. He owns a house. He pays a mortgage. He has a neighbor who presumably watches him periodically disappear for hours-long combat excursions and has made a choice to not ask questions about it. The show briefly visits Ernie's domestic existence in a way that makes him feel, unexpectedly, like a real character with a life, which makes the recurring destruction and apparent death he suffers in each fight slightly more weighted than it first appeared. The fourth fight is Internal Affairs from Season 9, which takes place across a train station, a cruise ship, and ultimately an airport. The airport sequence includes a moment that pays homage to a specific scene from Raiders of the Lost Ark. The propeller on an airplane becomes a weapon, and the fight's choreography at that moment is a deliberate visual quotation from the Harrison Ford film. The show is not just doing a chicken fight anymore, it is doing a chicken fight that functions as a cinematic reference. Each subsequent fight gets larger, more elaborate, and more cinematically ambitious. The later fights involve time travel. Ernie and Peter end up on Stewie's time machine return pad during one encounter, taking their combat through history. They fight in ancient settings, in industrial environments, across city skylines. The scope keeps expanding because the show's implicit promise with the chicken fights is that each iteration will be bigger than the last. One detail about the chicken fights that very few people have processed: they always end with Ernie apparently dying. He is thrown from heights, he is crushed, he is shot. He is subjected to violence that would realistically be lethal, and then he always survives. The show does not explain how he survives. The show does not address the fact that he keeps coming back. It is simply established as fact that Ernie cannot die from a Peter Griffin fight, the same way that certain horror movie villains cannot die from anything the protagonist can throw at them. Ernie's survival is built into the fabric of reality in this fictional universe. He and Peter will fight again. This is eternal. The show eventually gave Ernie a proper name through his wife Nicole. She addresses him as Ernie during the dinner sequence, which is the first and only time his name is spoken on screen by a character other than the production team through supplementary materials. For years, fans simply called him the Giant Chicken or occasionally the Chicken Guy. The name Ernie sits in the canon quietly, delivered once, in the middle of a combat restaurant sequence that is itself in the middle of a brawl, that is itself in the middle of an unrelated episode. There is a fan theory that has circulated in the show's online communities for years about what the chicken fights actually represent. The theory holds that Ernie is not a real chicken, but a physical manifestation of Peter's relationship with impulsive aggression, that every time Peter destroys a neighborhood, fighting a giant chicken over something as trivial as an expired coupon, the show is doing an extended comedic exploration of what happens when masculine ego and wounded pride go completely unchecked. The chicken fights are not about a chicken. They are about what Peter becomes when he decides that a minor slight demands a disproportionate response, and then keeps escalating that response regardless of the collateral damage. Whether or not you accept that reading, it adds something to the experience of watching the fights. They are funny as pure spectacle. They are slightly more interesting if you think about what they say about Peter's relationship with conflict. The final fight, a later season installment that received coverage in some outlets as potentially the last chicken fight after Ernie's apparent ultimate death, is animated with a kind of valedictory weight, as though the show itself knows it is closing something out. Whether that closing sticks remains, as with everything in this show, somewhat uncertain. But the architecture of the feud across more than a dozen seasons is one of the more impressive pieces of sustained absurdist comedy any animated series has produced. Part 4. Stewie Griffin, The Evil Genius Years, The Hidden Weapons, and What the Baby Was Actually Planning. Stewie Griffin, in the first 3 seasons of Family Guy, is one of the most genuinely alarming characters in American animation. Not funny alarming, actually alarming. He builds functional weapons, not cartoon weapons, precision-engineered devices capable of doing real damage in the show's internal reality. He constructs ray guns, laser emitters, mind control arrays, weather modification systems, and shrink rays, all from materials he sources, through means the show never fully explains but which imply an access to resources and technical knowledge that should be literally impossible for a 1-year-old. The humor of early Stewie is grounded precisely in that impossibility. This tiny person, this creature who is supposed to be in diapers and learning to walk, is doing things that would challenge MIT-educated physicists. And he is doing it while maintaining a complete outer presentation as a normal infant, because the adults in the house either cannot hear him or cannot process what they are hearing. Let us walk through what Stewie actually builds during those first 3 seasons, because the specifics matter. In the pilot episode, Stewie is shown with a fully operational laser gun that he stores in his room alongside various other devices. This is not foreshadowing or implication. The laser is demonstrated to work. In Chitty Chitty Death Bang, he activates a mind control device capable of influencing the behavior of adults around him. In Da Boom, the Y2K episode, the chaos of the episode temporarily disrupts Stewie's plans. But in the background of those scenes, there are indications of projects at various stages of completion. In Peter, Caviar Eater, Stewie has a shrink ray that he uses on Lois in what he describes as an experimental phase. In Running Mates, he has constructed what amounts to a small missile system inside his room. The room itself is worth attention. In those early seasons, if you pause on establishing shots of Stewie's bedroom, you can see equipment in the background that is never formally introduced or explained: circuit boards on shelves, devices connected to power sources, what appears to be a cooling system for something that generates significant heat. His room is not a baby's room that happens to contain some unusual objects. It is an active laboratory that happens to contain a crib. The relationship between Stewie and Lois in those first 3 seasons is the engine of his character. His obsession with killing her is, on its surface, pure absurdist comedy. A baby fixated on matricide is funny in the same way that all extreme inversions of expected reality are funny. But the show, at its best in those early episodes, gives the obsession a strange internal logic. Stewie's complaints about Lois are specific. He objects to being fed foods he finds repugnant. He objects to the infantilizing way she handles him. He objects, on some level, to her having complete physical control over his existence during a period of his life when he is developmentally unable to assert any independence. His desire to kill her is an expression of the frustration of being trapped in a body that has not yet caught up with his mind. There is a reading of early Stewie that treats his evil genius as a coping mechanism, the only available response for an extraordinarily intelligent consciousness imprisoned in an infant's limitations. He cannot drive. He cannot use a full-size keyboard. He cannot reach most surfaces without a step stool. He cannot be taken seriously by any adult around him, regardless of how sophisticated his arguments are. So he builds weapons, plans global domination, and fantasizes about destroying the person who has the most daily control over his existence, because those are the only expressions of power available to him. The other adults in the show largely cannot understand Stewie. This is established in the first episode and maintained with some consistency through the early seasons. When Stewie speaks, adults hear either babble or nothing at all. Brian is different. Brian can understand Stewie, can engage with him as an intellectual equal, can have actual two-way conversations with him. This is why their friendship becomes so central to the show. Brian is, for Stewie, the only relationship he has where his real self is witnessed. In the Season 2 episode Road to Rhode Island, the first of the Road 2 episodes, Stewie and Brian are separated from their families and have to make their way back to Foxbury, later renamed to the fictional Rhode Island town from Palm Springs, on their own. This episode is the formal beginning of their partnership as a comedic unit and the beginning of the most significant relationship in the show's emotional life. Brian sees Stewie not as a baby but as a companion, neurotic, demanding, occasionally terrifying, but genuinely someone worth being around. And Stewie, in Brian's company, is able to be something that he cannot be with anyone else, himself. The hidden lore within the early Stewie episodes includes a detail that most viewers missed in real time, but that retroactively makes certain scenes considerably more interesting. In Mission Impossible from Season 3, Stewie enters Peter's body as part of a plan to prevent the birth of a sibling, and inside Peter's body he encounters other potential siblings as spermatozoa. One of these is a character who will become significant in later seasons, Bertram. At this stage, Bertram is just a sperm who recognizes Stewie's intelligence and tries to form a temporary alliance. Stewie's initial hostility to him softens slightly when he realizes they have something in common. They part on something like friendly terms. This is Bertram's first appearance. He is a sperm in Peter's reproductive system. 4 seasons later, through a series of plot mechanics involving a vasectomy and a misfiled sample at a fertility clinic, Bertram will be born to a gym teacher and her partner who used Peter's donated genetic material and will become Stewie's most dangerous rival and the closest thing the show ever produced to a genuine arch-villain. Stewie's collection of weapons across the run of the series would fill an armory. The time machine is the most significant, but it sits alongside dozens of other devices. He has a shrink ray. He has a laser cannon. He has a mind control device that he deploys in multiple episodes to manipulate teachers, neighbors, and occasionally his own parents. In Season 5, he acquires a mind swap device that he uses in an episode where he and Brian accidentally exchange personalities, leading to a sequence where Stewie and Brian's body attempts to maintain the deception, while Brian and Stewie's body is forced to operate in a world where he is physically the size of a toddler. In Season 6, he builds what can best be described as a personal defense system housed inside a teddy bear, which raises questions about what other ordnance might be concealed inside Rupert, his beloved stuffed companion. Rupert deserves its own entry in Stewie's lore. The stuffed bear has been with Stewie from the first episode and has occupied a position in his life that hovers somewhere between a comfort object, a confidant, and a genuine relationship. In early Stewie's framework, where he presents one face to the world and has an entirely different inner life, Rupert is the safe container for the softer parts of his personality that cannot be shown elsewhere. He talks to Rupert. He plans with Rupert. He trusts Rupert in a way that he trusts almost nobody who can actually respond to him. In the Season 9 episode Brian's Got a Brand New Bag, one of the later episodes where Brian's behavior has already become considerably less sympathetic, Brian chews Rupert to pieces while drunk because he is tired of Stewie treating the bear as a real person. Stewie's reaction to this destruction is the closest the show ever comes to depicting Stewie's grief in a raw and uncomedic way. He is devastated, not petulant, not scheming revenge. Genuinely, quietly shattered in a way that the episode does not try to undercut or play for laughs. Rupert being destroyed by Brian is, in the emotional grammar of their relationship, one of the most serious things Brian ever does to Stewie. The Club of Forgotten Children is perhaps the darkest piece of Stewie lore in the entire series. In a Season 3 episode, it is revealed that Stewie, frustrated with a group of toddlers at a playgroup who did not meet his standards, had constructed a secret pit beneath the playgroup location and had been trapping these children in it. The sequence is played as horror comedy, but the underlying premise, that Stewie built a functional underground prison and successfully imprisoned multiple children in it without any adult noticing, is among the show's most extreme examples of what early Stewie was actually capable of. He called it the Club of Forgotten Children. The children are presumably still in there, in the show's canon, because no subsequent episode addresses their fate, which is the kind of loose end that the show happily leaves unresolved, because resolving it would require confronting the implications directly. Part 5. The Time Machine. Every trip through history, every hidden detail. Stewie's time machine is introduced in the Season 5 episode Road to Rupert, not as a grand reveal but almost as a background object, something Stewie already has presumably built at some unspecified earlier point, and uses with the confidence of someone who has been operating this particular piece of equipment for a while. The show does not dedicate an episode to his building it. It is simply there, in his room, a device whose existence the audience is expected to accept the same way they accepted his other devices. The machine's first significant use as a plot driver comes in Road to Germany from Season 7, and the circumstances of that use are themselves a piece of hidden lore. Mort Goldman, the anxious, accident-prone neighbor who operates a pharmacy in the show's fictional Rhode Island town, wanders into Stewie's room and mistakes the time machine for a portable toilet. He uses it as such. By the time Stewie and Brian realize what has happened, Mort has disappeared into the past. Specifically, into Poland, on the 1st of September 1939, the day the Nazi invasion began. The comedy of Road to Germany operates on multiple levels simultaneously. There is the broad slapstick of Stewie and Brian trying to rescue Mort from wartime Europe without creating temporal paradoxes that would alter the present. There is the more specific comedy of Mort Goldman, who is Jewish, being trapped in the middle of the Holocaust and having to navigate that reality with the full weight of what it means pressing on every moment. And beneath both of those layers is a genuine adventure story with stakes that the show takes seriously enough to give it a real climax. The episode also contains a detail that requires attention. The group eventually reaches England safely, where they can fix the return pad, and they make it back to the present through a sequence involving the Royal Air Force. But the mechanics of their return, specifically the moment where Stewie has to create a distraction that allows them to escape, involves a musical performance number that the show sets up and then interrupts before it can be completed. Mort stops the performance before it can happen, and the group escapes by other means. The musical number that never happened is a running gag that the show acknowledges without ever delivering. The time machine's operational mechanics are established gradually across its appearances. The machine itself is the transport device, but it also comes with a return pad, a separate piece of equipment that looks roughly like a television remote and allows the user to return to the present from wherever they have ended up. This two-component system becomes important in Life of Brian from Season 12, when Stewie destroys the main time machine out of exhaustion with the chaos it has caused, but accidentally destroys it moments before Brian is killed by a car. Without the machine, Stewie cannot go back and prevent Brian's death. He still has the return pad from a future trip he made, but without the main machine to get to a point in the past where he can intervene, the return pad is useless. The solution comes in Christmas Guy, the episode immediately following Life of Brian. In a shopping mall during the holiday season, Stewie notices another version of himself, a past Stewie, who is there with the return pad from before the time machine was destroyed. This past Stewie still has his device. Current Stewie convinces past Stewie to lend him the return pad, creating a temporal loop in which the device that will eventually allow current Stewie to save Brian is the same device that past Stewie was using for an entirely separate purpose. It then travels back far enough to save Brian on the street where he was killed. The elegance of this solution using a time machine's own timeline against itself, finding the exact moment where a version of himself would have the equipment that current Stewie needs, without having to explain how he got back there in the first place, is the kind of creative mechanics that the show did very well when it committed to working out its own logic. Back to the Pilot from Season 10 is the show's most self-referential use of the time machine, and it contains more hidden details per minute than almost any other episode in the series. Brian and Stewie travel back to the 31st of January 1999, the exact date of the premiere episode Death Has a Shadow, ostensibly so Brian can find a tennis ball he buried on that day. What they find when they get there is the 1,999 versions of themselves and the rest of the family operating inside the events of the pilot episode. The episode is structured as a critique of the pilot's own storytelling. The 1,999 characters pause awkwardly during cutaway gags, standing in silence while the gag plays, because the show is pointing out that cutaways literally remove characters from the episode's reality while they are happening. Time-traveling Brian and Stewie observe this and find it bizarre. The joke is a meta-commentary on the show's own format, delivered from within the show itself by two characters who are explicitly visiting the format from a distance of 10 years. There is a specific detail in Back to the Pilot that requires you to have seen the pilot episode to catch. When Brian and Stewie arrive in 1999, Stewie points out that something looks wrong about Peter's face, specifically that his eye is positioned differently than it should be. This is a direct callback to an actual animation error in the pilot episode, where one of Peter's eyes is visibly misaligned. The 1,999 Peter's eye is in the wrong position, and Stewie notices this and comments on it, which means the show is not only acknowledging the animation mistake from its own pilot, but is acknowledging it by having a future version of one of its characters observe it with confusion. The episode also contains the show's most extended use of time paradox comedy. Brian inadvertently mentions to his 1,999 self that the 11th of September 2001 will happen, which sets off a chain of events in which 1999. Brian uses this information in ways that gradually alter the present that current Brian and Stewie come from. By the time they return, there have been consequences. The history has shifted in ways that affect everything. To fix this, they have to go back again and undo what 1999 Brian did. But this second visit creates its own paradoxes. And the resolution, which involves an increasingly absurd multiplication of Stewie and Brian versions accumulating in the past, all trying to prevent each other from giving different information to 1999. Brian ends with approximately 50 copies of Stewie and Brian occupying the same point in 1999 simultaneously, all shouting at each other and getting in each other's way. It is among the most logically worked-out pieces of comedy in the show's history, and it rewards pause and rewind viewing to catch all the different Stewie and Brian variants in the background. The Big Bang Theory, from Season 9, is the most cosmologically ambitious time machine episode, and it contains a piece of lore that connects to two other established pieces of the show's mythology in surprising ways. Stewie and Brian are fighting over the time machine when they accidentally activate it in a way that launches them outside the space-time continuum, literally outside the universe, into a void where the laws of physics do not apply. From this extra-dimensional position, Stewie's return pad can still theoretically function, but with no physics to operate on, it has to create its own. Stewie realizes, in this void, that by overloading the return pad's reactor and triggering a massive energy release, he can generate enough force to push them back into the universe. He does this. The energy release is sufficient to restart the universe's expansion from scratch. Stewie Griffin caused the Big Bang. The show commits to this. It is not implied or played as a joke that the audience is expected to dismiss. It is established as literal fact in the show's internal continuity. The Big Bang that created the universe was the energy release from Stewie's return pad, which means everything that has ever existed, every galaxy, every star, every planet, every organism, every human civilization exists because a baby genius and his talking dog got in an argument over a time machine. The same episode reveals that Stewie's ancestor, the person from whose bloodline Stewie eventually descends, is Leonardo da Vinci. This is why Bertram, who in this episode travels back to the Renaissance to try to erase Stewie from existence by killing his ancestor, targets Da Vinci specifically. When Bertram kills Da Vinci, the universe begins to unravel because Da Vinci was part of the causal chain that eventually produced Stewie, who created the universe in the first place. Kill Da Vinci, and the universe ends. The paradox loops back through itself. Stewie kills Bertram to preserve his own ancestor and thereby preserve the universe and thereby preserve himself. In the same action, Stewie is both saving the universe and maintaining the specific causal chain that makes his own existence possible. He is, at that moment, simultaneously the creator of all things and the defender of his own right to exist. Part 6. Road to the Multiverse and Every Universe They Visited. The Road to episodes represent the most consistently high-quality strand of storytelling in the entire Family Guy catalog. They are the episodes that even critics and skeptics of the show's later seasons tend to acknowledge as works of genuine creative ambition. And the best of them, Road to the Multiverse from Season 8, is arguably the most inventively constructed 30 minutes the show ever produced. The Road to format was established in Road to Rhode Island from Season 2, which drew its premise from the classic Bing Crosby and Bob Hope Road to film series. In those 1940s films, Hope and Crosby would be placed in an exotic location and have to navigate their way back to civilization through a combination of comedy, musical numbers, and the specific chemistry of two performers who genuinely enjoyed working together. McFarlane and the writers saw that the Brian and Stewie dynamic mapped onto this structure almost perfectly the sardonic, literary dog and the scheming. Aristocratic Baby had enough shared chemistry and enough fundamental difference to make the stranded-together premise feel fresh rather than forced. Road to Rhode Island is a lovely episode, Stewie and Brian attempting to get home from Palm Springs after a series of complications, with Brian confronting a moment of genuine emotional weight when they pass through the puppy mill where he was born and discovers that his mother was stuffed after her death and is now being used as a decorative object. That detail Brian's mother as a taxidermied table ornament, visible in the background of a rural Texas home, is delivered with a casualness that makes it considerably more haunting than an overtly sad treatment would. Brian sees her. Brian has a moment. The episode moves on, but you do not forget it. Road to Europe in Season 3 sends Brian and Stewie to the UK after Stewie becomes obsessed with a British children's television show, a sequence that rewards attention because the British children's program in question is a pastiche of several actual BBC productions and contains background details in its animation that reference specific British cultural touchstones. Road to Rupert introduces the time machine in the context of Brian accidentally selling Rupert at a garage sale and the two of them traveling to Aspen to retrieve the stuffed animal from its new owner. This episode's hidden detail is in the garage sale scene itself, where numerous objects sold in the background are briefly visible and include items from previous episodes that Stewie had been working on. Road to Germany has been discussed. Road to the North Pole is a Christmas episode in which Stewie and Brian decide to visit Santa Claus, and the visit goes violently wrong. A subplot that involves a version of Santa who is not the benevolent gift giver of tradition, but a much darker figure, and which ends with consequences that require Brian and Stewie to take over Christmas delivery themselves and make an absolute mess of it. But Road to the Multiverse, the Season 8 premiere, is the episode that takes the format as far as it can possibly go and represents the single greatest display of the show's creative ambition in its post-revival period. The premise: Stewie has built a multiverse remote control that allows the user to jump between parallel universes. He and Brian use this device to explore a series of alternate realities. Each universe they visit is animated in a completely different style, a formal choice that means the episode is not one animated show, but several different shows within a 30-minute runtime. The universes they visit, in order, and what each one reveals. The first universe is the one where Stewie acquired a genetically engineered pig with a superabundance of muscle, the universe he had been traveling to and from before the episode begins. This universe is presented in the show's standard animation, and the pig is the MacGuffin that initiates the entire story. Next comes a universe where Christianity never took hold, which means there was no Dark Ages, no period of intellectual stagnation caused by the church's opposition to scientific inquiry. In this universe, scientific progress has continued uninterrupted for 2,000 years. The result is a society so technologically advanced that it makes the present look primitive. Everything works. Everything is clean. The architecture is impossibly elegant. And there is a version of Meg who is, in this universe, genuinely beautiful and socially magnetic. Because without the specific series of historical events that produced the current Meg, she became something entirely different. The episode gives this detail about a second to land before moving on, and it is one of the sharper jokes in the sequence. The implication is not just that this universe is more advanced, but that the specific misfortune of being Meg Griffin in the current universe is, at least in part, a product of contingent historical circumstances rather than something inherent to her. The Flintstones universe is animated in the style of Hanna-Barbera's 1960s production, with the limited movement, the flat backgrounds, the repeated scenery in the background. Brian's comment in this universe is that the animation looks cheap and lazy, which is the show doing a pointed joke at the expense of Hanna-Barbera specifically. Given that Seth MacFarlane got his professional start working at Hanna-Barbera, the joke lands differently knowing that context. The Japanese-controlled universe is a version of America where the atomic bomb was never dropped, the Pacific War continued, and Japan eventually prevailed. The result is an America that looks like a fusion of American suburban architecture with Japanese cultural overlays. There is a Japanese Meg in this universe who commits suicide, a joke that the episode delivers with a directness that reads as either satirical or simply callous, depending on your relationship with that kind of comedy. The Disney universe is the most elaborate of the alternate realities and the one that required the most production investment. The Family Guy characters are reimagined in the Disney animation style: soft watercolor backgrounds, animal companions, fluid movement, and the sequence includes an original song called "It's a Wonderful Day for Pie." That is a genuine piece of musical composition in the Disney tradition. The song sounds exactly like something from a Disney film of the 1940s or 1950s. The instrumentation is correct, the melody is appropriately saccharine, the lyrics are enthusiastically wholesome, and then Mort Goldman walks into the Disney universe, and every Disney animated character turns on him with a coordinated, violent hostility. The joke is about Walt Disney's alleged anti-Semitism, a long-standing accusation against the historical Disney that the show deploys as a dark punchline. This is the kind of joke that the show did very well in its best periods. A genuinely funny joke embedded in a satirical observation that has a real target. The Robot Chicken universe is animated in stop motion, in the visual style of Seth Green's competing adult animation program. The show's characters appear as small action figures in a toy-sized version of their living room, and the sequence is a direct conversation between two shows, Family Guy and Robot Chicken, that have existed in tension throughout their respective runs. Stewie's comment to the characters in this universe, "How does it feel to be on a major network for 30 seconds?" is a dig at Robot Chicken's Adult Swim home. Chris's response in this universe, shouting something unprintable, is delivered by Seth Green, who voices Chris in the main show and also created Robot Chicken, meaning he is simultaneously the person being mocked and the person doing the mocking. The actual universe, the real world, with real people, appears briefly when Stewie and Brian accidentally arrive there. In this universe, they are an actual dog and an actual baby, neither of whom can communicate intelligibly. Brian, as a real dog, is immediately in danger of being hit by a car. They escape back to an animated universe as quickly as possible, but not before the real-world Brian gets struck. The show is commenting, very briefly, on what their characters would actually be if they existed outside the frame of the cartoon. The universe ruled by dogs is the episode's structural endpoint, a world where the evolutionary hierarchy is reversed and humans are kept as pets by intelligent dogs. This universe is where Brian would obviously thrive, and where Stewie, having spent the episode asking Brian to go somewhere that suits his personality, finally finds something that seems good for someone other than himself. But the humans in this universe are headed for the pound, and the episode's resolution involves escaping before that fate arrives. There is a universe that appears very briefly that the episode barely addresses. A universe populated by a single man, far in the distance, whose only function is to give compliments to Stewie and Brian as they pass through. He appears for approximately 3 seconds. He says something encouraging. The scene cuts. The joke is the gentleness of the universe itself, a world that contains nothing except positive reinforcement, and the oddness of that from within the show's usual register. The multiverse episode took the Road to format and extended it beyond travel to a physical destination and into travel between entire realities, and the decision to animate each universe differently was a production challenge significant enough that it required outsourcing segments to different studios, including the Robot Chicken team, for their universe specifically. The result is an episode that functions as a showcase for everything animation can do when it is not constrained by the need to maintain a consistent visual identity. Part 7. Blue Harvest and the Star Wars Trilogy: Every Easter Egg and Hidden Detail. In 2007, Family Guy produced a feature-length parody of Star Wars: A New Hope, broadcast as a special episode under the title Blue Harvest. This was followed in 2009 by Something Something Something, Dark Side, a parody of The Empire Strikes Back, and, in 2010, by It's a Trap, a parody of Return of the Jedi. The three together form what the show calls the Laugh It Up Fuzzball Trilogy, and they represent a sustained creative achievement that goes considerably deeper than simple parody. The title Blue Harvest is itself an Easter egg that most people who watch the episode would not immediately recognize. Blue Harvest was the working title used during the production of Return of the Jedi, not A New Hope, but the third film in the original trilogy. George Lucas and his production company used the name as a decoy to prevent the press from knowing what they were filming, because by 1982, the Star Wars franchise had become so enormous that production locations were being mobbed by fans and journalists whenever the real title was associated with a shoot. Blue Harvest came with its own fake tagline, Horror Beyond Imagination, and was used on all production documents, equipment, and crew clothing to deflect attention. So, the episode that parodies A New Hope is named after a fake title created for Return of the Jedi. The title is a piece of Star Wars trivia functioning as an inside joke for people who know Star Wars history deeply enough to recognize it. For most viewers, it is just an unusual choice of name. For the people who know, it is a signal about the depth of research that went into the production. The casting of Family Guy characters in Star Wars roles is itself a set of commentary choices. Peter as Han Solo is obvious. Both are braggadocious working-class types who project more confidence than their actual competence justifies, and both have complicated relationships with authority. Brian as Chewbacca works because Brian and Chewie occupy similar structural roles in their respective partnerships: the loyal, intelligent companion who does the emotional labor, while the more charismatic human takes the credit. Stewie as Darth Vader is the show's most pointed casting choice. Vader is the show's most obviously parallel figure for what Stewie was in the early seasons, a character defined by his relationship to power, control, and the desire to impose his will on the world around him. Having Stewie voice Vader is the show acknowledging that Stewie's original conception and Vader's are drawing from the same archetype, the brilliant, ruthless intellect in a position of terrible power, whose voice and manner suggest a sophistication that makes the violence even more unsettling than it would be from a cruder personality. Herbert the pedophile as Obi-Wan Kenobi is perhaps the most uncomfortable casting choice, and therefore the most intentional one. Herbert's relationship to young boys and Kenobi's relationship to young Luke are placed in uncomfortable proximity by this casting, in a way that the show is completely aware of and absolutely exploiting. The jokes in Blue Harvest that emerge from this parallel are the episode's darkest material. The episode contains approximately 30 individual cultural references and Easter eggs beyond its main Star Wars parody framework. Some of the more obscure ones require specific knowledge to catch. The TIE fighter pilots in the space battle are wearing the colors of the TIE flag gold and red because their ships are TIE fighters, and TIE sounds like tie. One of the pilots in the cockpit is shown speaking TIE. The joke is a pun operating on 3 levels. The Star Wars acronym TIE stands for Twin Ion Engine, which is a detail from the Star Wars expanded universe that was never stated in the films themselves, the homophone, and the visual detail of the TIE flag colors. This is the kind of gag that required knowing what TIE actually stands for to construct. When the heroes arrive in the Mos Eisley Cantina, one of the background figures visible in the bar scene is Bender from Futurama, a robot who is explicitly violating the cantina's well-established no droids policy. This is a crossover Easter egg between two Fox animated shows, inserted in the background of a scene that most viewers will be watching for the parody content of the foreground. The wedding scene when Luke, Chris, Han, Peter, and Chewie Brian go to the wrong floor and accidentally walk into a wedding instead of the celebration at Alderaan features the two people getting married as characters from 2.5 Men. The married couple are named Alan and Judith, both major characters from that show. This is a crossover Easter egg between a Fox animated show and a CBS live-action comedy, inserted into a parody of a 1977 science fiction film. The hyperspace travel sequence is animated as a parody of the Doctor Who opening credits, specifically the Tom Baker-era Fourth Doctor version, with its tunnel of abstract shapes and colors. The show is noting that hyperspace as a visual concept in Star Wars and the time vortex in Doctor Who occupy a similar function in their respective sci-fi universes, and it is doing it in the most direct possible way. The Jawas on Tatooine, who in the original film are collectors of old droids and mechanical equipment, have in this version collected an early 1990s dot matrix printer. The printer appears among their salvage inventory as though it were as valuable as the droids. When C-3PO, Quagmire disembarks from the Jawa sandcrawler, he thanks the printer for the sex, which is both a Quagmire joke and a reference to the Spaceballs character. Dot Matrix, a robot parody of C-3PO, who is both a Spaceballs in-joke and a pun on the printer. Technology. The lightsabers in this version of Tatooine are used by the locals as bug zappers. This is a detail visible in the background of the Mos Eisley exterior scenes, deployed with no emphasis or acknowledgement, just there, in the background, for people who are looking. One of the most self-referential Easter eggs in Blue Harvest is the opening sequence, where the massive Imperial Star Destroyer crawls overhead in the establishing shot, and visible on the hull is a Bush-Cheney 2004 campaign bumper sticker. This is a political joke about the relationship between the Bush administration's militarism and the empire's authoritarian expansionism, delivered in the form of a bumper sticker on a Star Destroyer. It appears for approximately 2 seconds. It is never commented on by any character. Something, something, something Dark Side, the Empire Strikes Back parody, derives its title from a specific piece of Family Guy internal lore. In the Season 8 episode Barely Legal, which, confusingly, aired after the Season 6 Blue Harvest but before the Season 8 Dark Side special, there is a cutaway gag in which Emperor Palpatine calls Darth Vader and triumphantly announces that he has figured out the formula for all Star Wars dialogue. The formula, as delivered by Palpatine, is something, something, something Dark Side. Something, something, something complete. This cutaway is planting the title of a special that had not yet aired, hiding it inside an earlier episode so that viewers who caught the callback when Dark Side premiered would feel the specific pleasure of recognition. This is the kind of long-game Easter egg that requires planning the callback before the thing being called back exists. The writers knew they were going to make an Empire Strikes Back parody. They inserted a reference to that parody's eventual title into a different episode before the parody aired, turning the title itself into an Easter egg for attentive rewatchers. It's a Trap completes the trilogy with a parody of Return of the Jedi, and its title is a reference to Admiral Akbar's most famous line from that film, a line that by 2010, when the episode aired, had already achieved deep meme status on the early internet. The episode contains a meta-commentary on that meme's popularity, with characters acknowledging that "it's a trap" is something Akbar says, and that this acknowledgement has now become unavoidable whenever Akbar is on screen. There is a moment in this episode where the characters explicitly discuss the fact that they are running out of things to parody in the Return of the Jedi material, and that the film itself is considered the weakest of the 3 original Star Wars films. The Ewoks, who in the original film are the small bear-like creatures who help the Rebel Alliance defeat the Empire on Endor, are handled in "It's a Trap," with a deliberate acknowledgement that audiences have always found them implausible and slightly annoying. The episode's version of the Ewok scenes leans into this criticism rather than smoothing it over, which is the show being honest about the source material while still maintaining the parody. The trilogy as a whole, watched consecutively, reveals a coherent piece of Family Guy meta-commentary about the show's own relationship with popular culture. It does not just parody Star Wars, it uses the Star Wars framework to examine what it means to be a show built on cultural reference. What happens when that reference system meets genuinely beloved material, and how far you can push parody before it stops being affectionate and starts being something else. The answer the trilogy arrives at is pretty far, actually, if you know the material deeply enough to find things worth saying about it. Part 8. Brian and Stewie locked in a bank vault. The deepest episode. On the 2nd of May 2010, Family Guy aired an episode called Brian and Stewie. It was the 150th episode of the series, which may be why the show gave itself permission to do something it had never done before and has not done since. The episode has no cutaway gags, not fewer than usual, 0, none. It also has no subplot, no additional characters, and no musical numbers within the main narrative. It takes place entirely in a single location, a bank vault, and features only 2 characters for its entire runtime. It was written by Gary Janetti, directed by Dominic Bianchi, and runs approximately 27 minutes in its uncut form. The premise: Brian has visited the bank to access his safety deposit box. Stewie has come along. While they are both inside the vault, the door automatically closes at the end of the business day, locking them in. There is no way out until the bank opens on Monday morning. What happens inside the vault is the show at its most emotionally honest, and the reason this episode is worth unpacking in detail is that it reveals, more clearly than almost any other installment, what the show understood about these 2 characters at its best. The episode begins with comedy. Stewie has soiled his diaper in the moment the vault door closed, and the problem of what to do about this is handled in a way that is genuinely funny and genuinely disgusting. Brian has to deal with the diaper. This is the show's way of establishing that the episode will not be precious about what it is doing. It will be funny and honest simultaneously, rather than choosing one or the other. As the night wears on, Stewie finds Brian's safety deposit box and they go through its contents together. Inside the box, some cash, some documents, and a gun. A loaded gun. Stewie asks Brian why he has a gun in his safety deposit box. This is the pivot point of the episode. Brian's answer takes a long time to arrive. Because he drinks first, there is a flask of scotch in the box alongside the gun, and Brian drinks from it before he is willing to speak. And when he does speak, he tells Stewie the truth. The gun is there in case he ever wants to end his own life. Brian has thought about suicide. He has thought about it seriously enough to make practical preparations for it. He has kept those preparations at arm's length in a vault, not in the house, so that the impulse cannot act on itself in a moment of weakness. But the preparations exist. He then says that being with Stewie gives his life meaning. That Stewie is the reason the gun has stayed in the vault. Stewie's response to this revelation is not comedic. It is not deflective. He tells Brian, quietly and without irony, that Brian is his only friend, that Stewie loves him, that Stewie needs him, and that Brian gives Stewie's own life its purpose. The show has 2 of its most important characters tell each other, directly and sincerely, that they love each other and that their relationship with each other is the thing that makes their existence bearable. This is a scene that Family Guy produced in 2010, in an episode that begins with diaper content, in a show that was, in that same season, capable of the Conway Twitty musical gag and the Peter knee injury joke stretched for 40 seconds. The episode was deliberately constructed as the show's 150th, suggesting that the production team wanted the milestone to mean something. It does mean something. It is the single clearest demonstration of what the Brian and Stewie relationship is actually about, beneath all the adventure and comedy, 2 fundamentally isolated personalities who found each other and chose to stay. The episode received mixed reviews when it aired, because many viewers who came to Family Guy for the cutaway format and the rapid-fire joke structure found a 30-minute character study jarring. Some were uncomfortable with the emotional directness. Some found the diaper content too off-putting to stay engaged through to the emotional payoff. Some felt it was too different from what the show normally did to be considered in the same frame as a regular Family Guy episode. All of those responses are understandable. But the episode deserves its reputation as one of the show's genuine achievements, a piece of television that takes 2 animated characters that millions of people love for comedic reasons, and demonstrates that those characters have internal lives complicated enough to carry a drama. There is a small Easter egg hidden in the episode's final moments. As the vault door opens on Monday morning and Brian carries Stewie out into the lobby, The music that plays is a brief snatch of the theme from the Road 2 episodes, the recurring musical motif that has underscored Brian and Stewie's shared adventures across the series. It lasts for about 4 seconds. It is not credited in the episode's musical attributions. It is there for the attentive viewer, acknowledging that what has just happened inside the vault is part of the same story as everything else they have done together. Part 9. The wildest Peter Griffin stories ever told. Peter Griffin across his full run is the protagonist of some of the most structurally ambitious episodes the show ever produced, and many of the wildest Peter stories are also the ones that contain the most carefully hidden details. Peterbus Unum from Season 2 remains one of the most perfectly constructed episodes in the series' history, and its premise is one of those ideas that should not work on paper, but does because the execution is completely committed. Peter, in the process of trying to build a swimming pool in his backyard, discovers through a bureaucratic oversight that his property is technically not part of the United States. His land fell through a crack in the surveying process at some historical point, meaning his address exists in a genuine legal limbo. Peter's response to this discovery is to declare the property an independent nation. He names it Pretoria, with himself as its founding father and sole leader. The joke begins here but does not stay here. The episode then follows the logical consequences of this declaration with something close to rigorous, absurdist logic. Pretoria must have a flag, must have international recognition, must have relations with neighboring nations, must have, apparently, a policy on annexing adjacent territories, because Peter annexes Joe's pool and installs it as Pretoria's only water feature. The flag of Pretoria is a detail worth pausing on. It features a lion, an eagle, and a steroid syringe. The choice of imagery communicating something about the values of the nation's founder without requiring any dialogue to make the point. Peter's attempts to get Pretoria recognized by the international community put him in contact with some of the late 20th century's most infamous leaders, Saddam Hussein, Muammar al-Gaddafi, Slobodan Milosevic, all of whom appear at a party Peter throws at which they are presented as merely difficult social guests, rather than internationally designated war criminals. The party sequence contains background details, documents on Peter's desk, framed portraits he has hung that are small jokes about what Peter's government looks like. The episode ends with the United States intervening militarily in a conflict they name Operation Desert Clam, a direct parody of the Gulf War Operation Desert Storm, with the clam substituted for the geographically accurate storm. Peter surrenders and America reabsorbs Pretoria. The entire sequence of events, from discovery to founding to annexation to military intervention to surrender, takes 22 minutes. DeBoom from Season 2 is the Y2K episode, and its ambition is remarkable for a second season episode of a show that had not yet established whether it would get a third. The entire episode is structured as a post-apocalyptic adventure film. The Y2K bug does, in this version of events, cause the collapse of civilization, and Peter and his family must navigate a ruined world in search of a Twinkie factory that Peter believes will serve as the foundation of a new civilization. This involves traveling through a ravaged Rhode Island, encountering various factions of survivors, and eventually establishing what Peter calls New Quahog. The sequence in which Peter founds New Quahog and declares himself mayor for life contains several hidden details. The charter he writes for the new community is visible briefly on screen and includes provisions that reflect Peter's specific priorities. Beer-related rights occupy at least 2 articles. The flag of New Quahog is visible in the background of several shots and changes between cuts, suggesting either careless continuity work or a deliberate joke about a new nation that has not yet settled on its own symbols. The episode also contains a mutated version of Stewie, a consequence of whatever radiation or contamination the apocalypse involved, who is considerably larger and more powerful than normal Stewie, and who has, apparently, finally achieved some measure of the power he has been seeking. This mutated Stewie appears only in this episode and is never referenced again, which is either an oversight or the show acknowledging that the alternate timeline of DeBoom is a closed branch. PTV, from Season 4, is the episode where Peter creates his own television network, PTV, after the FCC begins aggressively censoring broadcast television following a wardrobe malfunction during a live awards show. The joke target is obvious, but the episode executes it with enough technical knowledge about broadcast regulation and enough specific parody of actual FCC enforcement history to reward viewers who know that history. Peter's uncensored programming includes a variety show with content that is presented as shocking but is mostly just adult in a broad, childish way. The humor is less about the content itself and more about the context, which is a middle-aged man from a working-class Rhode Island town presenting himself as the vanguard of free expression. The most famous sequence from this episode is the FCC song, performed by Peter, Brian, and Stewie, which is constructed as a parody of the classic Disney Broadway musical number format and is genuinely well composed as a piece of musical comedy. The song catalogs the FCC's perceived overreach with a cheerful, bouncy tune that makes the anger beneath it land more effectively than an angrier delivery would have. The episode ends with the FCC arriving with literal censor bars, physical strips of black material that they begin applying to things in the physical world of the show. The visual of censor bars applied to real-world activities rather than to screen content is one of the show's better pieces of visual comedy. Stewie kills Lois and Lois kills Stewie. The two-part Season 6 epic is the episode that, more than any other, represents the potential of what the show could have been if it had committed to allowing its characters real consequences. The first part of this two-parter follows through on the premise that has been simmering since Season 1. Stewie finally acts on his years of planning and shoots Lois. The episode ends on this cliffhanger. Lois appears to be dead. The second part deals with the fallout of Lois's death. Peter is accused of the murder, Stewie takes over the world as he has always planned, and the episode moves through the logical consequences of these events with a degree of commitment that most episodes of this show never achieve. Characters react to things that happened in the previous episode. The story moves forward. Things feel real. And then the show reveals that all of this has been taking place inside a simulation on Stewie's computer. He ran a model to see what would happen if he killed Lois. None of it happened. Everything resets. The twist is clever in the moment. Retroactively, it is a demonstration of exactly the habit that the show could never fully break: the refusal to let consequences stick, the reset button, the acknowledgement that nothing can truly change because the show needs all its pieces in place for the next episode. But Stewie kills Lois and Lois kills Stewie remain among the most formally ambitious 2 hours of television the show ever produced, and within the simulation, the storytelling is genuinely impressive. Three Kings from Season 7 is an anthology episode in which the Griffins adapt 3 Stephen King stories: Stand By Me, Misery, and The Shawshank Redemption. Each segment recasts Family Guy characters in the King materials roles, and each is handled with enough respect for the source that fans of the original works find both the parody and the sincerity satisfying. Stewie as Annie Wilkes in the Misery segment is the episode's peak. Annie Wilkes in King's novel and Rob Reiner's film is a specific kind of terrifying, a person whose surface friendliness conceals a capacity for controlled, purposeful violence. Stewie's established character in the show's earlier seasons is exactly this type. The joke of the casting is not that Stewie is playing against type, but that he is perfectly suited for this particular villain in a way that makes every moment of the segment feel earned. The Shawshank Redemption segment, with Brian as Red and Quagmire as Andy Dufresne, contains background details visible in the prison sequences notices on bulletin boards, objects and cells that are jokes visible only if you pause and read them. The production team hid content in the margins of the frame that they knew most viewers would never see, because they were the kind of people who put that kind of effort into their work. Road to the Multiverse has been discussed in full, but there are additional details in that episode worth cataloging here. The compliment universe, the universe that contains only a single man giving compliments from a distance, is stranger and more unsettling on reflection than it appears in the episode. A universe in which the only living being is a person who exists to praise others is not a paradise. It is a deeply lonely construction. The complimenting man does not receive compliments himself. There is no one there to give them to him. He compliments Stewie and Brian as they pass through, and then presumably resumes his existence in a universe with no one else in it, continuing to offer praise to an empty reality. The show puts this universe in the episode for about 5 seconds and moves on without comment. But if you sit with it, it is one of the sadder things the show ever depicted. Part 10. Hidden Easter eggs, background details, and production secrets. Family Guy's production team has a long history of hiding content in places where most viewers will never look. Background details, visible only if you pause the episode, jokes embedded in text that appears on screen for less than a second, callbacks to earlier episodes hidden in the scenery of later ones, and production Easter eggs accessible only through DVD menus or special features. The newspaper Easter egg is one of the oldest recurring production games in the show's history. Throughout the series, whenever a newspaper appears on screen, the headline is typically relevant to whatever is happening in the foreground scene. But the smaller articles below the headline, the stories that would appear in columns beneath the main story, often contain entirely different jokes that have nothing to do with the episode's plot. In the Season 4 episode Model Misbehavior, when Lois holds up a newspaper to show that the Griffins have made the front page after winning a boat race, the main headline is visible and relevant. In the lower right corner, in text small enough that you would need to pause and enhance to read it, is a headline that reads DVDs before being cut off. The joke is that the show is acknowledging the DVD market, the very thing that saved it from cancellation, in a corner of a prop newspaper that virtually no one watching the broadcast would ever see. The Blue Harvest DVD contains a hidden Easter egg accessible through the Special Features menu. If you navigate to the Features section and highlight the entry for North by North Quahog, pressing the right arrow on your remote will highlight a cluster of bubbles that is not otherwise visible in the menu. Pressing select on this hidden highlight reveals a short clip of the cast table read for Something, 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 Darkside, the follow-up Star Wars special that was still in production at the time. This is a self-referential Easter egg that exists as both a preview and a reward for curiosity. The audience at this point knows the Darkside episode is coming because Blue Harvest's success made it obvious, but actually hearing the table read gives a specific kind of insider access to the production process. The Back to the Pilot episode contains an Easter egg involving the specific animation differences between the 1999 pilot and the 2010 version of the show. When Brian and Stewie arrive in 1999 and observe the other characters, the older versions are animated using the original Season 1 style, slightly rougher, slightly less polished, the character models at their earliest stage. This means that for a few minutes in the middle of a Season 10 episode, the show is animated in what is effectively a recreation of its own 1999 animation style. The technical effort required to accurately recreate that earlier style, including specific imprecisions that were characteristic of the original production, is considerable, and the fact that the episode then has Stewie comment on Peter's misaligned eye means the animators were specifically recreating a known mistake from the pilot rather than just approximating the old style. There is a recurring character in the background of multiple episodes who has become something of a fan obsession. The man sometimes called Holden Caulfield by fans and some production staff. This character appears in the background of various scenes across multiple seasons and seems to exist for the specific purpose of confronting Peter about his failures. The character's name has never been officially established in the show's canon, but his resemblance to a specific literary archetype, the cynical young man who sees through pretension and is angry about it, gave rise to his fan name. He appears in the background of at least a dozen episodes if you are specifically looking for him, each time in a slightly different context, but always with the same essential posture. A person who is aware of Peter's inadequacy and is processing that awareness with varying degrees of frustration. The show's practice of hiding cameos from other animated shows and background scenes has generated entire catalogs of discovered Easter eggs in the fan community. Bender from Futurama appears in multiple Family Guy episodes, the Blue Harvest Cantina scene being the most prominent but not the only one. In the Cantina sequence, Bender's presence violates the No Droids policy of the establishment, and the episode does not acknowledge this violation. It is entirely background. The American Dad alien Roger can be spotted in the background of certain street scenes easily missable, present long enough to be found by someone looking. The production process for Family Guy involves an unusual amount of writer performance. Executive producer Steve Callahan described the writer's room as a place where writers would literally stand up and perform their pitch for a joke or cutaway, doing voices, acting out physical comedy, making the case for why a specific gag would work through the force of their physical demonstration. This means that many of the show's cutaway gags began as actual performances in a writer's room that somewhere, the sequence of events that became a television moment started with a person standing on a desk in a Los Angeles office building doing an impression. Seth MacFarlane's voice for Peter Griffin has a specific real-world origin that MacFarlane has discussed in interviews. He based the character's vocal pattern on a security guard he encountered during his time in Providence, Rhode Island, during his student years and shortly after. This person, whose name MacFarlane has not disclosed publicly, had a specific manner of speaking that MacFarlane found both funny and somehow perfectly representative of a certain kind of New England working class personality. The voice is not an impression of a famous person. It is a loving capture of a specific, real individual who probably has no idea that his voice has been heard by hundreds of millions of people. Quagmire's catchphrase, "giggity," was not in the character's original conception and was introduced in the revival seasons as a shorthand for his personality. The fact that even Stewie uses the catchphrase once in the Bank Vault episode represents either a continuity error or an intentional in-joke, and given the level of deliberate detail in that particular episode, the latter seems more likely. Stewie saying "giggity" in a moment of minor excitement is the show briefly acknowledging that this catchphrase has become so embedded in the show's vocabulary that even a character as elevated as Stewie has absorbed it. The show's internal geography has been a source of fan analysis since the early seasons. The fictional Rhode Island town has inconsistent spatial relationships between locations. The Drunken Clam is sometimes across the street from the Griffin house, sometimes several blocks away. Quagmire's house shifts position. The school's location changes. This is entirely normal for a long-running animated show that does not use consistent location maps, but eagle-eyed viewers have constructed what amounts to a fan-made map of the fictional town based on every establishing shot ever used in the series, attempting to reconcile contradictions and establish a coherent geography from the available visual data. The map they have produced is internally inconsistent in ways that cannot be resolved because the show itself did not maintain consistency, but the effort represents the kind of deep engagement that this particular fictional world generates in its most devoted audience. The show's theme song contains a piece of musical trivia that is not obvious from listening but rewards knowing. The Family Guy theme, "You Have Lot to See," performed in-universe as a Broadway-style production number by the cast in the opening credits, is structured musically as a direct descendant of the theme. Song tradition from 1970s. American sitcoms, particularly the warm, optimistic, slightly old-fashioned style associated with shows like All in the Family. The melody structure, the orchestration choices, the lyrical rhythm, these are all deliberate evocations of a specific era of television music, and the choice to use this style for a show that was pointedly not a traditional sitcom was itself a joke about expectation and subversion. Part 11. The crossover episodes and what they revealed. Family Guy has crossed over with a remarkable number of other properties during its run, and each of those crossovers contains its own ecology of Easter eggs and hidden details. The most significant crossover in the show's history is The Simpsons, Family Guy event broadcast in September 2014, titled The Simpsons Guy. This was not a segment, it was a full 45-minute episode in which the Griffin family traveled to Springfield and spent the runtime interacting with the characters from The Simpsons. The episode was produced jointly by the creative teams of both shows and required levels of coordination between two productions that normally exist in careful competition. The Simpsons Family Guy crossover is loaded with meta-commentary about the relationship between the two shows, which has always been complicated. The Simpsons premiered in 1989 and became the dominant animated comedy of the 1990s. And Family Guy launched in 1999 carrying accusations, some of them fair, that it was drawing too heavily from what The Simpsons had established. Seth MacFarlane has addressed these accusations in various ways over the years, sometimes dismissively, sometimes with more acknowledgement. The crossover episode uses the occasion to put those tensions on screen directly. The fight between Peter and Homer, which mirrors the structural logic of the Peter and Giant Chicken fights, and which Peter explicitly frames as being about who owns the concept of a big, dumb oaf who is married to a beautiful, competent woman, is the crossover's most pointed piece of meta-commentary. It is the show asking directly, are these the same show? And is Peter literally fighting Homer to answer that question? The fight goes on for a very long time. in exactly the way the chicken fights do, which is itself an acknowledgement that this style of extended combat parody originated in Family Guy rather than The Simpsons, a small territorial claim embedded in the fight itself. Ralph Wiggum's cameo in this episode, in which he appears alone, says, "I'm in danger," while a completely inappropriate expression plays on his face, and then exits is one of the most celebrated moments of the crossover for Simpsons fans, because it is perfectly in character for Ralph and requires no explanation for anyone who knows the character. It is also one of the more efficient pieces of comedy in an episode that tends toward longer, more ambitious sequences. The subplot involving Meg and Lisa Simpson is the crossover's most generously handled story. Lisa, who serves a similar structural function in her show to the one Meg serves in hers, the most thoughtful member of the family, the one who sees clearly and is not heard, encounters Meg and recognizes something of herself in her. Lisa encourages Meg to find her gifts and pursue them. She helps Meg discover an aptitude for the saxophone. They become genuine friends. The relationship is treated with real warmth and is not undercut by the episode for comedic purposes. This is the crossover doing something that neither show alone could do, using the collision of two fictional universes to tell a story about what happens when two characters who occupy the same structural role in their respective shows actually meet. Lisa and Meg are both underestimated daughters in families that do not fully appreciate them. What does it mean for each of them to be seen by someone who occupies the same position? The episode takes this question seriously. There is a background detail in the crossover that has been discussed extensively in fan communities. When the Griffin family first arrives in Springfield and is driving through the town, the Springfield locations visible in the background are drawn in the Simpsons animation style, rather than the Family Guy style, creating a subtle visual discontinuity. Characters from the Griffin side are drawn in Family Guy's style, characters from the Springfield side are drawn in the Simpsons style, and the backgrounds shift style depending on whether they originated in one show's universe or the other. This means the crossover episode is, on a technical level, two different animated shows sharing a frame, with the visual style of each frame communicating which show's reality currently has priority. The Robot Chicken universe in Road to the Multiverse is a different kind of crossover, less a collaboration than a territorial provocation. Seth Green's Robot Chicken and Family Guy have existed in a public creative tension that was never openly hostile, but was sufficiently charged that when Family Guy decided to place the characters in a Robot Chicken animated universe, it was understood as a comedic provocation. Green's willingness to participate to provide the stop-motion animation for the sequence, to have Chris say something spectacularly rude about being on a major network for 30 seconds is itself a piece of meta-commentary about the relationship between the two shows. They are competitors who are also colleagues who are also, through Seth Green's involvement with both, formally interconnected. The American Dad crossovers, which happen intermittently across both shows' runs, are some of the most casually embedded Easter eggs in either series. In the Stewie Kills Lois two-parter, when the FBI team bursts through a door during the investigation, the agents are Stan Smith and an officer who works under him in American Dad. This is not commented on. The American Dad characters appear, do their FBI agent thing, and the episode moves on. The Easter egg is visible for about 3 seconds. Similarly, the American Dad alien Roger has appeared in the background of various Family Guy scenes over the years, recognizable from his silver body and pink suit to viewers who know American Dad, invisible to viewers who do not. These background appearances are not crossover events. They are the production teams of two shows that share a creator and a network quietly acknowledging that their fictional universes exist in proximity, even if they do not formally share a continuity. The crossover between Family Guy and the Flintstones universe in Road to the Multiverse contains a specific detail about the history of animated television. Brian's comment that the Flintstones animation looks cheap and lazy is, as noted, a dig at Hanna-Barbera's production values, the limited animation style that characterized 1960s television cartoons, designed to be fast and inexpensive rather than expressive and fluid. But given that Seth MacFarlane worked at Hanna-Barbera early in his career, the dig has an autobiographical dimension. He learned his craft at the studio he is now gently roasting. The joke is not purely external. It contains a self-aware acknowledgement that this style is part of animation's DNA, including his own. Part 12. The Prophecies Family Guy Stories That Came True. One of the more unsettling categories of Family Guy trivia involves the number of times the show depicted or referenced events that subsequently occurred in real life, sometimes with a specificity that makes the coincidence feel almost impossible. The most discussed of these is the Kevin Spacey reference. In a Season 3 episode from 2005, Stewie runs through a department store shouting that he has escaped from Kevin Spacey's basement. In 2017, actor Anthony Rapp disclosed to BuzzFeed News that in 1986, when Rapp was 14 years old, Kevin Spacey had made unwanted sexual advances toward him at a party. The disclosure opened a period of wider public accounting of Spacey's behavior that resulted in him being removed from the final season of House of Cards and a substantial contraction of his career. When this history became public, the Family Guy clip circulated widely, and Seth MacFarlane addressed it directly. The show had no knowledge of Spacey's actual behavior. The joke was written as a random comedy of an absurd kind, placing a child character in an improbably adult situation as an absurdist setup. There was no inside knowledge. The specificity of the coincidence, a basement, a child, Kevin Spacey, was genuinely random. MacFarlane's statement is almost certainly true. The Family Guy writers' room was not in possession of suppressed information about Kevin Spacey in 2005, but the coincidence is real. And the reason it circulates is that it asks an uncomfortable question about comedy that deals in outrageous hypotheticals. When you spend years generating random outrageous scenarios at volume, some of those scenarios will eventually match reality. The question is whether that constitutes prescience, coincidence, or simply the statistical inevitability of generating enough material. The cannabis legalization episode is a case where the show's position turned out to be on the right side of history. The Season 7 episode 420, in which Brian leads a successful campaign to legalize marijuana in the fictional Rhode Island town, was itself controversial when it aired, generating the Venezuelan government's response discussed earlier. At the time, marijuana legalization was a fringe political position in American public life. In the decade and a half since, the majority of American states have legalized marijuana in some form, and the societal trajectory has moved substantially in the direction that Brian's advocacy in the episode suggested. The Brian's bestseller storyline, in which Brian writes a self-help book called Wish It, Want It, Do It, that becomes a massive commercial success, anticipated the culture of celebrity self-help publishing that would become a genuinely significant cultural presence in the late 2010s and 2020s. The specific criticism the show makes of the genre that the book's success has nothing to do with its actual quality and everything to do with celebrity association and clever marketing feels considerably more pointed now than it did when the episode aired in 2010. Peter's Micronation episode anticipated a genuine trend in internet culture. The concept of the sovereign citizen movement, in which individuals declare themselves not subject to federal or state laws on the basis of specific legal arguments, had existed in American political fringes for years before. Peterbus Unum, but the episode's comic treatment of a man declaring his property an independent nation and then negotiating with world powers as though he were a head of state arrived before this kind of thinking had become a widespread internet phenomenon. The episode was not predicting the future so much as observing something that had always been present in American political culture, the fantasy of opting out. But its observation landed as prescient when that fantasy became more culturally visible in subsequent years. There is also the show's handling of tanning bed obsession in a Stewie episode that aired in the mid-2000s, in which Stewie becomes addicted to artificial tanning, and the episode deals with the social pressures that make an obviously unhealthy practice feel necessary for social acceptance. The dangers of excessive UV exposure were understood medically at the time, but the cultural conversation about tanning beds as a public health concern became more prominent in the years following the episode, which is less a prediction than an observation slightly ahead of the mainstream curve. The show's handling of social media and internet culture, specifically the episodes in the middle seasons that dealt with viral fame, online reputation, and the strange economies of attention that the internet was developing, sometimes feel prescient because they were engaging with these dynamics when they were still relatively new phenomena, and the observations they made about those dynamics have since become conventional wisdom. One of the most quietly accurate things the show predicted is less dramatic than any of the above. The specific kind of culture that emerges around someone who becomes famous for doing something absurd on the internet and then cannot escape from that specific absurdity for the remainder of their public life. The episode is not specifically about a single real person, but the dynamic it describes viral fame as a trap. The way a single captured moment can define someone permanently in the public's memory, regardless of what they do, subsequently captures something about internet culture that the show understood early. The show also depicted, in a mid-run episode, a version of a famous golf player engaging in behavior that would subsequently become a major public scandal, with details specific enough that the parallels were impossible to miss when the actual events occurred. The show's writers, confronted with questions about the sequence after the fact, gave answers that suggested either extraordinary coincidence or sources they were not willing to identify. Most of these predictions are not actually predictions. They are observations about existing tensions, anxieties, and behaviors made at a high enough volume that some of them will eventually match something that actually happens. The show generated thousands of jokes across hundreds of episodes, many of them about people behaving badly in specific ways. Some of those bad behaviors eventually manifested in identifiable people. The appearance of prophecy is, in most cases, mathematics. But some of the coincidences are specific enough, and the gap between the joke and the real event long enough, that they feel like something more than coincidence. And in a show that has always been interested in the gap between what people present and what they are actually doing, that particular uncertainty seems entirely appropriate. The final section, what Family Guy actually preserved. We have traveled through more than 25 years of story, hidden detail, buried lore, and production secrets. We have walked through Stewie's weapons room and sat in the bank vault with Brian and his gun. We have watched Peter fight a chicken across a train, a cruise ship, and an airplane, and come back to the interrupted scene without missing a beat. We have been to every universe the multiverse remote could reach. We have read bumper stickers on Star Destroyers and found Bender in the background of the Mos Eisley Cantina. We have counted the Easter eggs, and there are more we did not get to. There are always more. The thing that Family Guy preserved, underneath all of the chaos and all of the worst decisions and all of the years when the show was running on inertia more than inspiration, was something genuinely worth preserving. It preserved a specific kind of American comedy voice, the voice of people who grew up watching television, absorbing it, loving it, and then turning it back on itself with affection rather than contempt. It preserved a commitment to animated storytelling as something that could do what no other form could do. Visit alternate universes, travel through time, have a baby, create the Big Bang, and take all of it seriously within the frame of a comedy about a Rhode Island family. The Brian and Stewie Bank Vault episode is not a fluke. It is not a sign that the show lost track of what it was doing and accidentally became something deeper. It is evidence that the people making Family Guy always knew what these characters were. They knew why Brian and Stewie needed each other. They knew what the chicken fights were actually about. They knew why early Stewie was dangerous and why that danger mattered. They hid that knowledge in the background of frames, in the margins of newspapers, in the corners of DVD menus, and occasionally in the emotional center of a 30-minute single-location bottle episode that went out to the world and made people feel something they had not expected to feel about a cartoon. Every episode, every background detail, every long-game Easter egg is a communication from the people who made it to the people who are paying close enough attention to receive it. The show rewarded attention across its entire run, even when it was not rewarding much else. And now you know where to look. If you made it here, and I hope you did, drifting softly wherever you are, lights off or low, the weight of the day finally somewhere further behind you, then you have earned something. You know this show in a way that most people who watched every episode never did. You know where the secrets are. You know why the chicken fights matter. You know that Stewie created the universe. That Brian kept a gun for reasons he only told one person. That the title Blue Harvest is a Star Wars trivia answer wearing an episode title as a disguise. There is always more. That is the promise Family Guy makes and keeps across more than 20 seasons and thousands of hidden details. There is always one more thing in the corner of the frame, one more callback you missed, one more joke in the margin of the newspaper that only rewards the person who paused and looked. Sleep well. Dream of alternate universes. And when you wake up, maybe there will be something in the background you have never noticed before. If any part of this brought you something tonight, a story that surprised you, a detail you did not know, a feeling of easy, familiar comfort, the best thing you can do is hit that subscribe button. It helps more than you might think. New stories, new deep dives, new rabbit holes to fall down, they are all coming, and the only thing you have to do to make sure they find you is be subscribed. See you next time. End of script, part 13. Every road to episode a complete journey. The Road to series is the spine of Family Guy's best work. Over the course of the show's run, Brian and Stewie embarked on 8 formally recognized Road to adventures, each one borrowing the structural grammar of the classic Hope and Crosby pictures from the 1940s, while doing something entirely its own. To watch all 8 in sequence is to watch the relationship between these two characters evolve across nearly 2 decades, and to notice details embedded in each episode that reward the full context of the others. The first Road to episode, Road to Rhode Island from Season 2, sets the template so cleanly that it almost feels like the show knew immediately what it had. Brian and Stewie are stranded at a Palm Springs airport. Stewie's parents have left without him. Brian is attempting to get a flight back to the fictional Rhode Island town, and they have no choice but to share the journey. What makes the episode work is the same thing that makes the Hope and Crosby pictures work. 2 fundamentally incompatible personalities discovering that they complement each other more than they conflict. Stewie's controlling, detail-obsessed planning temperament turns out to be precisely what Brian's looser, more improvisational approach needs. Brian's social fluency and adaptability turns out to be precisely what Stewie's brittleness requires. The episode's emotional core is Brian's detour through the Texas puppy mill where he was born. This moment arrives without warning and is handled with a lightness that makes it hurt more, not less. Brian's mother, or rather, what used to be his mother, is a stuffed object in someone's home. She was used as a table. Brian is confronted with the specific, unavoidable way that the world values or does not value the kind of creature he is. A dog. Not a person. Not a being with feelings that deserve acknowledgement. A dog which, when its life was over, was taxidermied and put to use as furniture. The scene lasts about 90 seconds. It does not dwell. Brian has a moment of quiet grief, and they move on, but it establishes something that the subsequent Road to episodes build on. The journeys are not just adventure comedies. They are opportunities for Brian to encounter aspects of his own existence that he manages to avoid in his daily life. Road to Europe from Season 3 gives Stewie his equivalent of that revelation. Stewie becomes obsessed with a British children's television program called Jolly Farm Review, which he watches on PBS and which he associates with a kind of warmth and belonging that his actual home does not provide. He wants to go to England to visit the show's set. What he finds there is that the show is not what it appeared to be. The presenters are coarse, dismissive, and deeply uninterested in the child who traveled across the Atlantic to meet them. The fantasy is not the reality. Stewie's response to this disappointment is what makes the episode interesting. He does not collapse. He processes the gap between the imagined and the real with something that looks almost like adult perspective, an understanding that the thing you love from a distance is almost never the thing you find when you get close to it. For an infant villain who has spent 2 seasons plotting world domination, this is a sophisticated emotional response, and it signals that the character's interior life is more complex than his evil scheming suggests. Road to Rupert from Season 5 is the episode where the time machine enters the Road to framework, establishing that Stewie's inventions are available as tools within these adventures. The Rupert plot Brian accidentally sells the beloved stuffed bear at a garage sale is both a comedy premise and a piece of character development. Brian's guilt about the garage sale mistake is genuine. He did not mean to sell Rupert. He did not even know what Rupert meant to Stewie when he made the sale. His remorse and his determination to fix the situation at whatever cost reflect the Brian of the better seasons, a character who cares about the people in his life and acts on that care even when it is inconvenient. The Aspen sequence in Road to Rupert contains a sustained piece of visual comedy involving ski slopes and rental equipment that functions as an action set piece in the same way that the chicken fights function in Peter episodes. Physical chaos as its own kind of storytelling. The episode also contains a subplot involving Meg being forced to drive Peter after he loses his license, which runs in parallel to the Brian and Stewie story, and occasionally intersects with it in ways that create geographic jokes about where different characters are at the same time. Road to Germany is the darkest Road to episode in terms of historical weight. Sending Jewish character Mort Goldman to Nazi Germany, even within the frame of a comedy, requires a kind of tonal management that the episode handles better than you might expect. The show does not sanitize the Holocaust for comic purposes. It maintains the historical reality as the pressure that drives the episode's stakes. This is genuinely dangerous. Being Jewish in Nazi Germany in 1939 was genuinely dangerous. The comedy that the episode produces comes from Stewie and Brian's reactions to the historical situation, their outsider perspective on events they know the outcome of, rather than from the events themselves being treated as funny. There is a musical number in Road to Germany that was planned, rehearsed by the characters, and ultimately stopped before it could be performed. Stewie and Brian are captured and about to be executed when Mort, in the process of stopping their escape from the Nazis, inadvertently prevents a Busby Berkeley-style musical production number from occurring. The joke requires the viewer to understand that a musical number is coming to see it being set up and then to watch it not happen. The humor is entirely in the anticipation and denial of a spectacle that would have been genuinely impressive if allowed to conclude. Road to the North Pole from Season 9 is a Christmas episode that takes a genuine tonal risk by presenting Santa Claus as a broken, barely functional figure. The North Pole, as Stewie and Brian find it, is not a magical workshop. It is an overwhelmed operation trying to meet demands that have grown beyond any possible capacity to fulfill. The Santa they find is not evil, he is exhausted. He has been Santa for so long, trying to maintain a tradition that has expanded into something no single operation can support, that he has hollowed out. He is a creature running on nothing, doing something he can no longer do, unable to stop. Stewie and Brian decide to help by taking over Christmas delivery themselves. What follows is a sustained sequence of failure, not comedic failure in the conventional sitcom sense, but genuinely catastrophic failure, with consequences for the families they visit that are shown rather than implied. Children receive the wrong gifts, gifts arrive broken. The sheer impossibility of the task becomes clear. The episode is, underneath its Christmas comedy packaging, about the distance between what Christmas promises and what Christmas is, the gap between the mythology and the reality of trying to make magic happen at scale. Roads to Vegas from Season 11 is the first Road to episode to pluralize the title, and this is not an accident. The episode's premise involves a malfunction in Stewie's teleportation device, a different piece of equipment from the time machine that creates duplicates of both Stewie and Brian, rather than transporting them cleanly. The result is 2 Stewies and 2 Brians, one set of each being the lucky version and one set being the unlucky version. The episode splits its narrative between these 2 tracks, following both the fortunate and unfortunate versions of the same characters through the same Las Vegas trip. The hidden detail in Roads to Vegas is in the specific way the unlucky versions experience the episode's events. The episode does not play the unlucky track purely as comedy. The version of Brian who draws the bad outcomes ends up in a situation of genuine desperation, one that recalls the emotional weight of the bank vault episode without triggering the same degree of depth. The lucky Brian and unlucky Brian are structurally connected. The lucky version's good fortune comes at a direct cost to the unlucky version, establishing that the episode's universe is zero-sum. Somewhere in Las Vegas, in this version of reality, whatever good fortune manifests for one set of travelers is balanced against the misfortune of their duplicate. The episode resolves this by having the unlucky Brian accept the cost and allow the situation to be resolved in a way that restores the universe to its proper state. It is a sacrifice that is played as both comedy and as something slightly more weighted. Road to India, from Season 14, is the Road to episode most focused on Brian's romantic life and the way his pursuit of idealized women consistently produces unhappiness. Brian falls in love with the voice of a technical support representative and travels to India to find her. What he finds is a woman who is genuinely interesting, but who does not match the projection he has been building around her voice. The episode is about Brian's relationship with fantasy, specifically the fantasy of the perfect woman, and how much of what he mistakes for love is actually attachment to a constructed ideal rather than a real person. The Road 2 episode that was announced but never fully delivered would have been Road to the Multiverse Part 2, which was teased in various production interviews but, as of the show's recent seasons, had not materialized in the form promised. The anticipation of a sequel to the most celebrated Road 2 episode is itself a kind of Easter egg, a promise held in the fans' collective memory, waiting. Each Road 2 episode contains at least one visual reference to the previous entries in the series. An object, a framing choice. An auditory cue that rewards sequential viewing. The musical leitmotif associated specifically with Brian and Stewie's adventures together is the most consistent of these callbacks, appearing in some form in each episode, but the visual references are more varied and more hidden. Part 14. The World of Herbert the Pervert, Mayor Adam West, and Quagmire's Impossible Life. The supporting character ecology of Family Guy is, in the show's best seasons, as carefully constructed as the main cast, and several recurring characters carry enough hidden lore to sustain their own extended analysis. Herbert the neighbor, credited in early seasons simply as Old Man before receiving his proper name, is one of the most uncomfortable comedy inventions in American animation. A character whose humor depends entirely on the audience being aware of what he represents, while the other characters around him remain oblivious. He is voiced by Mike Henry with a thin, fragile vocal quality that suggests advanced age and physical frailty, and his interest in Chris Griffin is presented with a directness that the show makes no effort to obscure. He is attracted to teenage boys. He says so, in various formulations, in nearly every episode he appears in. The show's use of Herbert is a case study in a specific kind of comedy that trades on the gap between the character's self-presentation and the audience's understanding of what he is. The joke is not that Herbert is innocent and the audience is misreading him. The joke is that Herbert exists in a context, the show's fictional Rhode Island town, where no one around him processes what he is clearly communicating, while the audience understands it completely. This gap between character knowledge and audience knowledge is one of the oldest tools in comedy, but Family Guy deploys it with a consistency and a specificity that makes Herbert unique. The episode "And I'm Joyce Kinney" from Season 9 devotes significant attention to Herbert's relationship with Chris in a way that acknowledges his character more directly than most episodes do. But the most unexpected piece of Herbert lore comes in the World War II set episode "German Guy" from Season 9, in which it is revealed that Herbert served as a soldier during the war and was, by the account offered in the episode, a capable and even heroic figure in that context. The episode introduces a German counterpart to Herbert, an elderly man who is on the opposite side of the same war, and the two old men's confrontation contains both comedy and something that functions as genuine dramatic tension. The detail that the episode establishes that Herbert, who in the present is a figure of discomfort and low-level dread, was once a young man in the middle of history's most consequential conflict, does not redeem him or excuse the present. But it adds a dimension to the character that the show is not obligated to add and that most writers would not think to include. Herbert was somebody before he was Herbert. He had a different kind of life. The person he became is not the whole of who he is. The show is not making this point to soften Herbert's edges. Those edges remain sharp. It is making the point because it is true of every character that their present is not the whole of their history. Mayor Adam West, voiced by the actual Adam West, who died in 2017, is one of the show's most consistently excellent recurring presences. His characterization draws directly on West's persona as a figure defined by one enormously successful role from his youth that overshadowed everything else he did, and the show treats this with surprising generosity. West was able to play the role of Adam West, playing a version of himself in a comedy that acknowledges the absurdity of his position, with a dry self-awareness that made every appearance feel earned. The Mayor West who appears in Family Guy bears little resemblance to any actual elected official. His decisions are driven by personal enthusiasm rather than civic responsibility. An episode where he purchases a lot of cats and then cannot manage them is one of the better examples, but the premise recurs in various forms across the series. Mayor West believes that the responsibilities of his office include pursuing whatever currently interests him, and the interests are never predictable. What the show discovered over time is that Mayor West worked best in small doses, appearing for a scene or two in episodes where his specific kind of detached, self-involved comedy was needed, rather than as the center of a storyline. The episodes that give him extended screen time are consistently less effective than the episodes where he appears for 2 minutes, does exactly one impossibly strange thing, and exits. He is a character who works as punctuation rather than prose. The hidden lore within Mayor West's recurring appearances involves the question of how he keeps getting elected. The fictional Rhode Island town presumably contains voters who continue to send this man to the mayor's office despite the demonstrable evidence of his tenure. The show occasionally acknowledges this paradox. There are jokes about the town's inability to produce a viable alternative candidate, and there are episodes where the civic disaster produced by West's administration generates genuine public anger that somehow resolves without him being removed from office. The most pointed of these is an episode in which the town confronts a serious infrastructure failure that can be directly attributed to the mayor's choices, and the community's response is neither recall nor reform, but a kind of resigned acceptance that this is simply how their municipality functions. It is a joke about American local politics that does not need to announce its satirical target. Quagmire's character contains contradictions so extreme that they amount to a kind of lore mystery of their own. He is, on the surface, defined entirely by his predatory approach to women, an approach so extreme and so consistently rewarded by the show's universe that it creates an ethical problem the show never fully resolves. But underneath the surface characterization, there are flashes of something different. A person with actual intelligence, a person who loves his father unconditionally after his father's transition, a person who maintains deep and genuine loyalty to his friends, despite the way those friendships are frequently strained by Peter's behavior. The episode Quagmire's Dad from Season 8 is the fullest expression of the humane side of Quagmire that the show is capable of producing. Quagmire's father, Dan, a decorated military officer, reveals to Quagmire that he is a woman and has been for some time, and that the transition to living openly as Ida has finally become possible. Quagmire's initial response is a confused and painful rejection. His eventual response after the episode allows him time to process is acceptance and love for the parent he has always had. The episode handles the transition with more care than a show of Family Guy's sensibility might be expected to exercise. The jokes that exist in the episode are not at the expense of Ida's identity. They are at the expense of Brian, who had a brief romantic encounter with Ida before learning who she was, and whose revulsion at this discovery is treated as the thing deserving of comedy rather than Ida herself. The distinction matters. The show knows where the joke is and where it is not. Ida West, as she is eventually known, becomes a recurring character who exists entirely outside the sexual comedy framework that defines almost every other female character the show has produced. She appears in subsequent seasons as a fully realized person, a military veteran, a parent, a woman who has made difficult choices and come through them with a clear sense of herself. She is, in her way, one of the most well-drawn characters the show has ever created, which is a surprising thing to say about a character introduced in a situation designed to embarrass Brian. Part 15. The Animation History of Family Guy, Every Style Change and What It Meant. Family Guy's visual history is more complicated than it appears, and understanding the different animation studios and techniques that produce the show's various seasons explains a great deal about why certain episodes feel different from others in ways that viewers register but cannot always. Name. The pilot and first season were animated at a variety of studios, with the production team still establishing its visual identity. The character models in Season 1 are slightly different from what they would become. The proportions are slightly off, the colors are slightly different, and there is a roughness to the movement that reflects both the limited budget and the genuine experimentation of a new show trying to find its look. The misaligned eye in the pilot that Back to the Pilot acknowledges is the most famous of these early animation inconsistencies, but it is not alone. Rough Draft Studios handled Seasons 2 and 3, and these are the seasons most beloved by animation-focused fans of the show. Rough Draft's style for Family Guy had a loose, expressive quality that suited the humor perfectly. Characters moved with a physicality that felt alive. Their faces had a range of expression that later production approaches would constrain. The walk cycles had personality. The physical comedy had impact. When Peter fell down or crashed into something in Seasons 2 and 3, the animation sold the joke in a way that later, stiffer production could not. The revival in Season 4 brought a new studio and a new visual style. The outlines became thicker and more consistent. The movements became more limited and more mechanical. The characters looked slightly more polished and significantly less alive. This is one of the most genuine losses in the show's history, not a creative decision, but a production reality, the consequence of a gap in production that disrupted the continuity of the studio relationships that had produced the earlier work. Subsequent seasons cycled through multiple studios, creating subtle variations in visual style that attentive viewers noticed but most could not articulate. The introduction of Toon Boom Harmony software as the production's digital drawing tool in the Season 8 period changed the texture of the animation in ways that were technically more consistent but aesthetically more sterile. Characters began to feel less like drawings and more like vectors, clean, scalable, but lacking the tiny imperfections that made the earlier work feel handmade. The Road to the Multiverse episode stands out in the show's animation history, precisely because it was the moment when the production team deliberately used animation-style variation as a storytelling tool. The Disney universe required a genuine Disney-style animation production, which involved bringing in animators trained in the Disney tradition. The Robot Chicken universe required stop-motion animation with actual physical puppets. The Flintstones universe required a recreation of the limited animation style of 1960s television production. The Real World universe required compositing the animated characters into actual filmed footage. Each of these approaches involved different technical workflows, different software tools, different people. The episode is not one animated product, it is 6 or 7, assembled into a coherent whole. The production effort required was significantly larger than a standard episode, which is reflected in the episode's reputation as a landmark achievement. The specific detail of recreating the 1999 animation style for Back to the Pilot mentioned earlier deserves further attention here. The animators on that episode had to study the original pilot's production characteristics, not just to approximate the look, but to specifically include the imprecision of the original. The goal was not to make perfect 1999 animation. It was to make the exact 1999 animation that existed in the actual pilot, including its mistakes. This required identifying what was accidental about the original and deliberately reproducing those accidents. It is technically challenging to deliberately make something imprecise in the specific ways that the original unintentional imprecision produced. The show's use of deliberately degraded animation quality as a comedy tool most prominently in the Flintstones parody, but also in various other context-specific sequences, reflects a sophisticated understanding of animation as a medium where style communicates meaning. When the show drops its normal production quality for a segment, the drop itself is part of the joke. The audience registers the style change and understands that it is intentional, which means the audience is being credited with knowledge of what normal looks like. The comedy depends on viewers having an internalized standard from which the degraded sequence departs. Part 16. The Death and Return of Brian Griffin. A Complete Chronicle. In November of 2013, Family Guy aired an episode called Life of Brian, in which Brian Griffin was struck by a car on the street in front of the Griffin house and died from his injuries on the way to the animal hospital. The episode was the 9th of season 12. The death was depicted without the comedic distancing that typically characterized even the show's most dramatically ambitious moments. Brian died, and the episode sat with that death. The Griffin family's grief was specific and real within the show's emotional register. Stewie's response was the most devastating not because it was the loudest, but because it was the most internally consistent. Stewie, who had been Brian's closest friend and constant companion for 11 seasons, did not have a grief that fit neatly into the comedy framework. The episode did not find ways to make his loss funny. He was simply, in the show's terms, broken. The decision to kill Brian Griffin was not made lightly. According to production accounts that emerged in the days after the episode aired, the decision was considered carefully and was intended to represent a genuine attempt to introduce consequence into a show that had been criticized for its resistance to permanent change. Brian was not going to be replaced by a knockoff version of himself. The replacement, a dog named Vinny, voiced by Tony Sirico from The Sopranos, was intended as a genuinely different character with his own distinct personality rather than a Brian surrogate. The public response to Brian's death was extraordinary in its intensity. Social media mobilized immediately. A petition to bring Brian back gathered significant signatures within hours of the episode airing. The story was covered by major news organizations. Fan communities that had been watching this show for years responded as though something real had happened, because in a meaningful sense, something real had happened to them. A character they had grown up with, a character they had followed across more than a decade of storytelling, was gone. 2 episodes later, Christmas Guy. The season 12 Christmas episode, Stewie used the temporal mechanics described earlier to go back in time and prevent Brian's death. Brian returned. Everything was restored. Vinny was gone. The family had their dog back. The production response to the public reaction revealed something about the difference between what the show said it was doing and what it was actually doing. If Brian's death had been a genuine narrative commitment, an attempt to force the show and its characters into confrontation with permanent loss, the response to public pressure would not have been to reverse it within 2 episodes. The reversal happened because the death was, ultimately, a ratings event. A shocking moment designed to generate the kind of response it generated, with the restoration following quickly enough that the audience could exhale. This is not a condemnation of the production choice. Ratings events are part of how long-running television shows maintain audience engagement. The chicken fights are, in a different register, also events designed to generate a specific audience response. The difference is that the chicken fights never pretended to be anything other than what they were, while Brian's death was framed as something more genuine. What makes this entire sequence worth examining in depth is what it revealed about the audience's relationship with Brian. The intensity of the response to his death was not primarily about the show's commitment to consequence. It was about 2 things: the specific resonance that Brian as a character had for the people watching, and the grief of people who understood, perhaps without fully articulating it, that what they loved about Brian had been gone for years before the car hit him. The Brian who died in season 12 was not the Brian people were crying over in their response. They were crying over the Brian of seasons 1 through 5, the Brian who was Peter's genuine friend, who was trying to write a novel that might never be finished, who loved Lois from a careful distance, who wanted to be taken seriously as an intellectual, in ways that his current circumstances made difficult. That Brian had been disappearing piece by piece for years. His death simply made the loss official. When Brian returned, he returned as the version of himself that had made people uncomfortable, the arrogant, hypocritical, occasionally cruel later-season Brian. The reaction to his return was relief, not because the good Brian was back, but because even the problematic Brian was better than no Brian. The show knew this, and it proceeded accordingly. Part 17. The Hidden Lore of Recurring Locations. The Drunken Clam, the Griffin House, the school, the Quahog Airport, the mall, these recurring locations in the show's fictional Rhode Island town are not just backgrounds. They carry their own accumulated history, and attentive viewers who watch episodes in sequence notice things in those locations that casual viewers miss. The Drunken Clam is the bar where Peter, Joe, Quagmire, and Cleveland gather. It appears in hundreds of episodes, and has been the site of major events in the show's history. Cleveland's departure for his own show happens near the Clam. Various relationship crises play out there. The friendships that define the adult male social world of the show's fictional universe are maintained and tested there. But the bar itself contains visual details that change across episodes in ways that are not always explained. The liquor selection behind the bar shifts. The clientele visible in background booths changes. There is occasionally a different bartender than the primary one. There are nights when the Clam appears significantly more crowded, and nights when it is essentially empty, and the difference is never accounted for narratively. These inconsistencies are typical of long-running animation production, but some of them are intentional specific episodes that require the Clam to feel different, lonelier, more chaotic, more celebratory, have their animators adjust the background to reflect that need. The Griffin House has changed more deliberately. The interior layout has been modified across seasons in ways that the show acknowledges with various degrees of directness. The kitchen has had its layout adjusted. The living room's furniture arrangement has shifted. Stewie's bedroom, the laboratory, has been shown from different angles in different episodes in ways that create spatial impossibilities when you try to map the room consistently. There is a fan theory about the Griffin House that holds that the spatial inconsistency of Stewie's bedroom is intentional, that his room is, through some application of his own technology, dimensionally larger on the inside than it appears from the outside. This would explain how a standard suburban bedroom contains what appears to be the equivalent of a fully equipped research facility. The theory is unsupported by any direct in-show evidence but is consistent with what we know about Stewie's capabilities. If he can build a time machine, dimensional expansion of his bedroom is well within range. The school, James Woods Regional High School, named after the actor in a running gag that produced one of the show's best-constructed multi-episode story arcs, has consistent interior geography that the show maintains better than many of its other locations. The hallways, the principal's office, and the main classroom visible in Meg and Chris episodes have remained relatively stable across seasons, which may simply reflect the fact that these locations appear less frequently than the house or the bar, and therefore require less ad hoc adjustment. James Woods himself has been a recurring character in the show's history, appearing initially as an actor being pranked by Peter using a trail of goldfish crackers, a reference to a real-life incident that Woods was associated with. The subsequent episodes involving Woods escalated the conflict between him and Peter into a sustained storyline that included Woods attempting to steal Peter's life, and the school ultimately being named after him through a sequence of events that the episodes do not fully explain but that the show treats as canon. The mall that appears in Christmas episodes and in Christmas Guy is animated with a level of background detail that rewards pause and look viewing during the holiday shopping sequences. Store names visible in the background are generally parodies of real retail chains with slightly wrong names, the kind of joke that requires the viewer to read signage in the background of a moving shot, which almost no one does on first watch. The show's commitment to hiding jokes in backgrounds that will only be found by a tiny fraction of viewers is consistent across its entire run, and the mall sequences are among the richer repositories of this kind of buried comedy. Part 18. The Music of Family Guy, Original Songs, and Hidden Musical References. Family Guy has produced a remarkable volume of original music across its run songs that range from Broadway-style production numbers to character-specific ballads to parody pieces that require genuine musical craft to execute. The show's reputation is built primarily on its comedy writing and cultural references, but the musical output represents a significant creative achievement that often goes underappreciated. The most famous original song in the show's history is probably FCC Song from the Season 4 episode PTV, which has been discussed earlier but deserves a deeper musical analysis. The song is constructed in the style of a full Broadway production number. It has a proper intro, a verse-chorus structure, a bridge, a key change in the final chorus, and a climactic ending. The orchestration is not a parody of Broadway orchestration. It is actual Broadway orchestration, produced by musicians who know the genre. The comedy of the song does not come from musical incompetence, it comes from the collision of technically sophisticated musical execution with content that is deliberately lowbrow. This contrast is the defining principle of Family Guy's musical comedy. The show consistently deploys serious musical craft in service of silly or transgressive content, and the gap between the medium and the message is where the humor lies. You Have a Lot to See from Season 3's Road to Rhode Island is a legitimate vaudeville song, the kind of piece that would have worked as an actual stage number in a different context about Brian and Stewie traveling across America. The Road to Rhode Island song earlier in that episode is a proper homage to the Hope and Crosby tradition, composed with enough understanding of that tradition to honor it while being funny about it. It's a Wonderful Day for Pie, from Road to the Multiverse, is the most technically accomplished of the show's original songs. The Disney universe requires an actual Disney musical number, and the production team committed to this completely. The orchestration uses the specific instruments and arranging techniques of Disney's classic period. The melody is constructed in the key signatures and phrase lengths that Disney used. The animation of the number uses the color palette and character movement style of Disney's 1940s and 1950s output. The song is not a parody in the sense of making fun of Disney. It is an extremely well-executed Disney-style song that functions within a satirical context through its content and the violence that interrupts it. The Stewie Griffin original songs, specifically the ones that emerge from his character in episodes where his theatrical personality is foregrounded, represent a consistent creative achievement across the show's run. The Lousy World sequence from Brian and Stewie never actually appears in the episode, but it was composed for a cut version of the episode and exists in the unedited broadcast cut as a much briefer glimpse. The All I Really Need Is the Boy sequence that appears in the broadcast version of the Bank Vault episode is a genuine musical theater piece, in miniature Stewie performing a gypsy-style ballad about his relationship with Brian, with full theatrical conviction. The Conway Twitty musical interludes, the most controversial musical content in the show's history, are worth understanding as deliberate anti-comedy. A full, unedited country music performance by the actual Conway Twitty, appearing in place of a joke, is the show making a specific kind of statement about filler, about content that fills time without generating value. The Conway Twitty gags are not accidents or lazy shortcuts, they are the show deliberately showing the audience what it looks like when a show stops trying to be good and just occupies space. Whether this self-awareness excuses the gags or simply contextualizes them is a question the show leaves open. The Bird is the Word sequence from Season 9's I Dream of Jesus is one of the show's most committed pieces of musical comedy. Peter discovers the song Surfin' Bird by the Trashmen and becomes so obsessed with it that the family is unable to function. The sequence's humor operates on repetition and escalation. The song plays once, it is funny in the context. It plays again, still funny. It plays a third time, beginning to be too much. It continues past the point where it should have stopped, past the point where it is funny anymore, past the point where it is annoying, and into a territory where the continued repetition becomes its own kind of transcendence. The joke is not the song itself, it is what happens to something funny when it is repeated past all reasonable limits. The original songs produced for the Star Wars trilogy episodes represent the most ambitious musical production in the show's history. The Laugh It Up Fuzzball compilation included work that required full orchestral scoring in the style of John Williams' Star Wars scores. The show's composers produced music that functioned as both genuine homage to Williams' work and parody of the specific conventions of that work, the particular way Williams uses brass and percussion for action sequences, his string techniques in emotional moments, his use of leitmotifs to track character relationships. The Star Wars parody episodes contain musical comedy that only lands fully for viewers who know the Williams scores well enough to hear what is being imitated and what is being gently mocked. Part 19. The Background Cast, a who's who of hidden characters. Family Guy's recurring background characters, the people who appear repeatedly in the fictional Rhode Island town without ever becoming fully developed regular cast members, form a secondary layer of the show's world that adds depth to the setting in ways that casual viewers rarely notice. Cleveland Brown, before departing the show for his own spin-off in Season 8, was the most prominent member of this secondary layer. His early characterization, calm, slightly passive, the peacekeeper in the friend group distinguished him from both Peter's chaos and Joe's law enforcement intensity. Cleveland's history with Loretta, his first wife, and the extended storyline around their marriage's disintegration gave his departure from the show a narrative context rather than simply removing a character. The spin-off, The Cleveland Show, ran for 4 seasons before being canceled, with Cleveland eventually returning to Family Guy's main cast. His return created a continuity question that the show handles with characteristic indifference. The events of The Cleveland Show are in the canon, which means Cleveland has additional history that is available to be referenced, but the show references it infrequently and inconsistently. Cleveland's second wife, Donna, who was established in the spin-off, occasionally appears alongside him in later Family Guy seasons, as do his blended family's children. The degree to which this history is actively engaged with varies by episode. Bonnie Swanson, Joe's wife, is a character whose visual history contains a specific continuity anomaly worth noting. For the first several seasons of the show, Bonnie was visually pregnant, participating in episodes in a state of obvious advanced pregnancy that lasted, by any realistic calculation, far beyond the normal gestational period. The in-universe explanation for this was never provided. The show simply did not address why Bonnie was pregnant for years. The eventual birth of her child, when it finally occurred, was handled in the Season 7 episode Baby Not On Board, and the child born was named Susie. In subsequent episodes, Susie grows from infant to toddler at a rate that is consistent with the passage of time within the show's loose continuity. The background characters who appear in the Drunken Clam scenes without being formally named or developed include several recurring figures who have been identified and cataloged by the fan community. One of these, a man in a blue shirt who appears in the background of bar scenes going back to Season 1, has been the subject of extensive fan theory about whether he is a deliberate Easter egg or simply a stock background character who the animators were too busy to vary across hundreds of episodes. The production team has never commented on this specific figure. The school counselor present in various Meg episodes as the most visible representative of the institutional response to Meg's social difficulties is a character who appears without a consistent name in the early seasons and acquires different names in different episodes as production. Oversight allowed inconsistencies to accumulate. Fan documentation of these name variations is extensive and reflects the kind of obsessive engagement that the show's world generates in its most dedicated viewers. Tom Tucker, the news anchor, is a fully realized recurring character whose presence in episodes reflects a consistent characterization that the show maintains even when he is a background figure. Tucker is vain, superficial, and possessed of the specific self-satisfaction of someone who has spent his career as the most visible face in a limited media market. His relationships, including a complicated dynamic with his newsroom partner, Diane Simmons, who was later killed in a notable storyline, are developed across multiple episodes with enough consistency to feel like actual character arcs. Diane Simmons' death in the Season 9 episode "And Then There Were Fewer" is one of the show's genuine dramatic achievements and also one of its more skillfully hidden narrative accomplishments. The episode is structured as an Agatha Christie mystery. The entire cast is gathered at a remote mansion for a dinner that turns deadly, and people begin dying one by one while the survivors try to identify the killer. The reveal of Diane as the murderer is foreshadowed in ways that are visible on rewatch, but genuinely surprising on first viewing. The episode was broadcast as an extended special and received more sustained positive critical attention than most Family Guy episodes in that period. The resolution of the episode with Diane killed by Stewie after she threatens to kill Meg is one of the show's most interesting convergences of its multiple emotional registers. Stewie saves Meg. The evil genius who has spent years treating Meg as beneath notice intervenes to preserve her life. His motivation in the moment is partially practical, Diane knowing too much about the show's criminal ecology, and partially something that the episode does not fully articulate, a recognition, perhaps, that Meg's continued existence matters even if the show has spent seasons suggesting otherwise. Part 20. The show that kept going and what that means. In April of 2025, it was confirmed that Family Guy had secured a renewal deal with its parent company that would extend the series through Season 27, carrying it to the 2028 to 2029 television season, and coinciding with the show's 30th anniversary. Each season would contain 15 episodes. The show was not simply surviving, it was being locked in for years of additional continuation regardless of whether the creative output justified that continuation. By the mid-2020s, the audience numbers for Family Guy on its Wednesday night time slot represented a fraction of what the show had drawn at its peak. The Season 20 premiere averaged approximately 1.3 million viewers. Season 23 had fallen to around 723,000 viewers for some episodes. A show that had launched to 22 million viewers after the Super Bowl and had averaged nearly 8 million at its revival peak was now being watched, in its new episodes, by fewer people than live in some medium-sized cities. And yet the show continues. It will continue through 2029, at minimum. The reasons are entirely comprehensible in business terms. The economics of animated production make Family Guy cheap to produce relative to the rights and licensing value it generates. The show's library, 20-plus years of episodes available for streaming and syndication, merchandise that still sells, brand recognition that remains globally powerful, generates revenue that has nothing to do with how many people watch new episodes on Wednesday nights. What this means for the buried lore, the Easter eggs, the hidden details, the long-game callbacks that the show has deployed across its history is that there is more coming. The show's writing staff, working in the tradition that was established in those first 3 seasons and has been continuously inhabited even through the periods when the show was at its least consistent, will continue hiding things in backgrounds, embedding references that require decades of cultural knowledge to catch, planting callbacks that will only pay off several seasons in the future, and occasionally, not always, but occasionally producing something that achieves the emotional depth of the Bank Vault episode or the creative ambition of the multiverse journey. The golden years are permanently preserved. Seasons 1 through 5, particularly the first three, represent a body of work that would be remarkable from any animated series. The later seasons, at their best, demonstrate that the people making the show retained their capability for excellence even when they were not consistently exercising it. The Easter eggs in Family Guy are, ultimately, communications. They are the show talking to the version of the audience that is paying the most attention, the viewers who will pause a frame to read a newspaper headline in the background, who will remember that a character said something in Season 2 that foreshadows something in Season 9, who will notice a musical motif buried in the underscore of a Bank Vault episode and recognize it as the theme from the Road to Adventures. The show has been producing these communications since the 31st of January 1999, and it will continue producing them as long as it continues to exist. Every episode contains something that most viewers will miss. Every background has a detail that rewards the person who looks closely. Every season plants something that a future season will call back. The lore is enormous, and it keeps accumulating, layer by layer, episode by episode, decade by decade. And somewhere in all of that accumulated detail, in the background of a bar scene, in the fine print of a fictional newspaper, in a piece of music that plays for 4 seconds at the end of a bottle episode, there are things you have not found yet. They are waiting. So wherever you are right now, lying in the dark, somewhere between waking and sleep, the sounds of your night coming through whatever window or wall surrounds you, you have traveled through all of it. The life of a show from its very first breath at Rhode Island School of Design, through its resurrection from cancellation, through its 20-plus years of stories, fights, time travel, alternate universes, and hidden secrets. The chicken will fight again. Stewie is still out there somewhere, building things in his bedroom that nobody in the house knows about. Brian is still at his desk with a glass of wine, beginning sentences about his novel. And in a bank vault somewhere in a fictional Rhode Island town, 2 characters who love each other have found a way to say so in the quietest and most honest way the show has ever managed. Sleep well. You have earned it. If you enjoyed this journey and want more, subscribe. It takes 1 second, and it means these deep dives keep coming. Leave a comment telling me where you are watching from and what time it is there. Every time zone matters. Every late night matters. See you next time. End of script. Appendix. 40 more hidden details worth knowing. This is the section for everything that did not fit cleanly into the main narrative. The specific, discrete Easter eggs, production facts, and hidden details that deserve their own moment of attention. The show has hidden the number 23 in various forms across dozens of episodes. This is not a Stewie-related lore point. It is a production in-joke that several writers associated with the show have included as a recurring signature. The number appears on jersey numbers worn by background characters, on building addresses visible through windows, on dial settings in scenes where someone adjusts a device, and in various other incidental contexts. There is no single confirmed explanation for why 23 specifically, but the recurrence across different writers' episodes suggests it's spread through the room as a shared game rather than being any one person's private signature. The Petercopter and the Hinden Peter are both canonical inventions of Peter Griffin's that the show introduces in the Season 4 episode, Peter's Got Woods. The Petercopter is a helicopter with Peter's face on the body. The Hinden Peter is a blimp, also bearing Peter's face. Both are introduced in a flashback that explains why Peter is no longer allowed to invent things. This is a one-episode detail that is never referenced again, but that has become a touchstone in fan discussions of Peter's engineering abilities, which otherwise consist of the 0 inventions visible in any other episode. In the Season 7 episode Ocean's 3.5, there is a heist sequence that directly parodies the Ocean's 11 franchise. The episode contains background cameo characters in the casino sequence that are dressed in ways clearly evoking specific Ocean's 11 characters, but who are never identified as those characters in dialogue. They are there for the audience member who pauses and notices what they are wearing. The recurring appearance of the word freakin' in Peter's dialogue is not random. In the early seasons, freakin' was used specifically in contexts where Peter is either surprised or proud of himself. In the middle seasons, as Peter's character became less consistently written, the word began appearing in other emotional contexts. In the later seasons, it appears relatively evenly distributed across Peter's dialogue regardless of context. Fan linguists who have cataloged this shift have used it as a data point about when Peter's characterization became less specific. The word's distribution reflects the character's loss of precision. The Quahog 5 News team has a name for itself that is never stated in the show. 5 is not a channel number. It is a reference to the 5 primary characters visible in any news segment, which is more people than most local television news desks in the fictional town's size would support. The excess staffing of the news desk is itself a background joke about local television news's bloated on-air presence. There is an episode in which Chris takes an art class and produces a painting that appears in the background of subsequent scenes in the Griffin house. The painting is not referenced in any episode after its creation. It simply hangs in a hallway visible in certain camera angles on the house's interior. Whether it is actually the same painting that Chris made in the art episode or a generic background element that predated the art episode and was not the same object is unclear from the animation, but the placement feels deliberate. The sound design of the chicken fights contains specific homages to the sound design of action films from the 1970s through 1990s. The impact sounds for punches and falls draw from a library of effects that were used in films from that period, and fans with extensive knowledge of film sound effects have identified specific sounds from specific productions within the chicken fight audio. The fights are, on an audio level, collages of film history. Peter's car, a brown 2004 Mercury Sable, or a similar generic sedan that the show uses as its default vehicle for Peter, has been in multiple accidents, been stolen, been involved in the chicken fights, been driven into bodies of water, and been visibly damaged across various episodes. It is always available in the next episode in pristine condition, which is the standard animated television approach to property that would otherwise require constant replacement. But in one episode briefly, in a background shot, the car is visible with a dent that appeared in the previous episode still present. This was apparently either an animation error or an intentional continuity joke, and it has never been officially clarified. The show's fictional TV. Within the show, The Real World, Quahog and similar programs that appear on the characters' televisions contain jokes that are sometimes harder jokes than the episode they are embedded in. An episode where a character turns on the television to find a show playing will sometimes contain content in that fictional broadcast that is funnier or more pointed than the surrounding material. This is especially true of episodes where the television content serves as a thematic comment on the main story. A satirical program that the characters are watching becomes a form of Greek chorus commenting on their own situation. In the episode Quagmire's Baby from Season 8, Quagmire discovers that he has a daughter from a previous relationship. The episode's handling of Quagmire's decision about whether to keep the baby involves a level of moral seriousness that surprises viewers who come to the episode expecting only comedy. Quagmire's conclusion that he is not equipped to raise a child and that giving her up for adoption to a loving family is the right choice is treated without irony. The episode does not reward him for this decision with comic comeuppance, nor does it condemn him for it. It simply depicts a character making a difficult and defensible choice with appropriate weight. The connection between this episode and the earlier Quagmire's dad is that both episodes treat Quagmire as a person with a genuine inner life, someone whose superficial characterization conceals both damage and depth. Quagmire's dad is about his relationship with a parent who has been through a difficult transformation. Quagmire's Baby is about his relationship with a child he is not ready for. Both episodes find a Quagmire who is capable of love and who makes choices based on that love even when those choices are costly. Both episodes are outliers in his characterization, and both are more affecting for being outliers. The Jerome is the New Black speech, in which Quagmire delivers his famous denunciation of Brian to Brian's face, is one of the most studied pieces of dialogue in the show's history, both for its content and its delivery. Seth MacFarlane, voicing Quagmire, plays the speech with a controlled, specific anger that builds steadily rather than erupting. Each point is delivered with the precision of someone who has thought about this extensively and has been waiting for the right moment. The speech is not an improvised outburst, it is a prepared case, and its prepared quality makes it more devastating than spontaneous anger would be. What the speech also reveals, in the context of Quagmire's general characterization, is that he has been watching Brian carefully for a long time. You cannot describe someone's failures with that level of specificity unless you have been paying attention to them. Quagmire hates Brian, and his hatred is informed by a genuine understanding of who Brian is. This is more than most people who dislike each other can say. The show's treatment of the 9/11 attacks in Back to the Pilot, where Brian from 2010 warns Brian from 1999 about the attacks, is one of its more genuinely unusual narrative choices. The show acknowledges 9/11 directly and seriously, without comedy, treating it as a fixed point in time that changing would save lives. The episode is about why you cannot actually change the past without cascading consequences, but the emotional weight of a character knowing that thousands of people will die on a specific date and being unable to prevent it without destroying the timeline is handled with appropriate seriousness. The show rarely permits this kind of direct engagement with contemporary tragedy, which makes the moment stand out. The Brian Writes a Bestseller episode contains a background detail that requires knowledge of publishing to catch. The cover of Brian's self-help book, Wish It, Want It, Do It, is designed in the specific aesthetic of early 2000s self-help publishing, a particular combination of fonts, color schemes, and design choices that were standard in the genre during that period. The joke is not just that Brian wrote a bad self-help book, it is that the book looks exactly like a bad self-help book would look in 2010, down to the production choices that communicate bestseller in this genre to anyone who has spent time in a bookstore. The background of the Griffin's living room changes between seasons in ways that are most visible if you pick a specific wall and track it across many episodes. The framed photographs on the wall, which in early seasons showed the Griffin family in poses that were consistent with their early characterizations, gradually changed as the seasons progressed, with new photos appearing that reflected more recent storylines and old photos disappearing. By the later seasons, the photo wall is a kind of compressed visual history of the show, containing images from moments across the series' run. The individual photos are typically too small to read clearly in broadcast quality, but in high definition they reveal details about which moments the production team chose to memorialize in the character's fictional domestic space. The show has, across its run, depicted every member of the Griffin family in situations that directly contradict their established characterization, and in almost every case, these contradictions occur within episodes that were clearly not written with full knowledge of the character's established history. Peter is occasionally shown to be genuinely mechanically skilled in one episode and incompetent with basic tools in another. Lois periodically demonstrates the calm, good judgment of her early season characterization, even in episodes otherwise defined by the colder, more detached post-revival version. These contradictions are the texture of a show produced by many different writers across many years, and they are part of why both the show's fans and its critics find it so difficult to characterize cleanly. It is not a consistent thing. It is a vast, complicated, internally inconsistent thing that nonetheless contains genuine moments of excellence at every stage of its existence. The Easter eggs and hidden details are part of what makes it that they are the evidence of people who cared, who put things in the background that most viewers would never see, who wrote callbacks that only a fraction of the audience would catch, who made specific and deliberate choices in the margins of every frame because they believed those choices mattered even when no one would acknowledge them. The show is full of things that most people will never find. That is not an accident. It is the production team's ongoing letter to the version of the audience that is paying the most attention. Across more than 25 years, that letter has accumulated into something enormous, a document of care and craft embedded inside a show about a dysfunctional Rhode Island family, hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right viewer to find it. You have now found quite a bit of it. There is still more. There always is. Script and Uncle Guy lore. One more thing. The show's relationship with its own mythology. There is a tension at the center of Family Guy that the show never fully resolved, and probably never intended to a tension between two things it wanted to be simultaneously. The first thing it wanted to be was a show that existed entirely in the moment. Each episode its own contained comedy event, characters as functions rather than as people, the past available to be referenced when convenient and ignored when inconvenient, no real consequences. No binding continuity, just the next joke, and the joke after that, delivered to an audience willing to show up each week for the experience of watching without the obligation of remembering. The second thing it wanted to be was a show with a mythology, a world with rules and history, characters whose present was shaped by their past, relationships that carried the weight of everything that had happened in them. The kind of storytelling that rewards long-term attention because there are things visible only to people who have been watching for a decade. Family Guy pursued both of these ambitions at once, in the same episodes, sometimes in the same scenes. This is why the show is so difficult to evaluate on simple terms of good or bad. It contains genuine examples of both, sometimes adjacent to each other, sometimes inside each other, sometimes in direct conflict with each other. The Brian and Stewie Bank Vault episode is the mythology impulse expressing itself without compromise. That episode is entirely about the accumulated weight of everything that has happened between these two characters across the years they have been together. It does not work for someone who just found the show. It works specifically because those who have been watching understand what is behind every line they speak, the history of their friendship, the things they have been through together, the specific ways they have each let each other down and shown up for each other. The episode is the mythology paying off. The Conway Twitty gag is the moment-to-moment impulse expressing itself without compromise. It is the show saying, "We do not need to give you anything right now. We can occupy time. The audience will still be here." This is not the show at its worst in terms of creativity failure. It is the show at its most confident about its relationship with its audience, and that confidence is perhaps the most troubling thing about it. The show knows you will keep watching even when it gives you a full Conway Twitty performance in place of a joke. The Easter eggs and hidden details exist in the space between these two poles. They are made by people who believe in the mythology, who are putting effort into the margins of the frame because they believe someone will look there. But they are placed inside episodes that may be primarily operating in moment-to-moment mode, episodes where the surface comedy takes priority and the hidden detail is a secondary communication running in parallel. This dual mode is ultimately what makes the show so rich as an object of long-form attention. The mythology is real, the hidden details are real, the care that produced them is real, and the show's simultaneous willingness to not care, to fill time with a country music performance, to reset any meaningful development the moment an episode ends that is also real. Both things are true at the same time. The show is sloppy and the show is meticulous. The show is lazy and the show is technically ambitious. The show abandoned its most original character concept and still produced the most cosmologically ambitious story ever told about that character's role in the creation of the universe. You hold all of it at once when you really know this show. The failures do not cancel the achievements. The achievements do not excuse the failures. The result is a wildly imperfect, intermittently brilliant, deeply strange piece of American television that has been running since before some of its current viewers were born and will apparently continue running until its 30th anniversary at minimum. There are things in it that you have not found yet. That is the promise the show keeps making, and the promise that keeps being true. Go look.